Hey now, it's your boy PSA Sitch here with everyone's favorite UBI supporter, then detractor, supporter again, Adam Friended.
Maybe detractors soon. I don't know. I
Maybe
answered
detractor.
I
We'll
answered
see.
no
We'll see
opinion
what
in the
Scott does
poll.
today. Maybe Scott will press you in the right direction, Adam.
Well, I look, everyone knows my intuitions. I want UBI to work because I feel like it adds a certain amount of fairness to the economy that I'm fully in favor of. I feel like there's obviously life is unfair. We know life is unfair. The whole
Mm-hmm.
goal of society is to make life a little more fair, really, right? The strong subjugating the weak is the state of nature. Society evolved to kind of get rid of that. So we're already pushing towards a little more fairness, and this seems like a push in the right direction to me. So, Scott, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Santens, and I've been a basic income advocate since 2013, so 10 years now. Is when I got into the concept. I got into it because of the automation argument. It was really before anyone started talking about automation, and I got into it because of like a thread on Reddit that was really talking about how no one was talking about automation.
Right.
And yeah, so nowadays a lot of people are talking about it, but back then they weren't. And the concern was what happens when we start automating a lot more stuff. And that introduced me to the concept of basic income, which I dove into. And it was just fascinating to learn about the history of it, about the philosophy behind it, about the evidence for it. And I've been pushing for it ever since after I realized just how important it actually is, I believe.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the automation thing, and Scott wrote an amazing article. I mean, you called it a book. I guess you have it in a book format as well.
Yes.
That I've read, probably 6 months ago, and I reread before the stream. You make some great arguments in that book, and also around the automation thing. I think we're going to start off talking about the debt ceiling, just because it's pertinent now. People are talking about it. So, did you have any particular questions about the debt ceiling,
Well,
or?
so I guess my question is the debt ceiling stupid? Or does it have a purpose? Did it ever have a purpose, or has it always been just like this ridiculous thing that we should get rid of?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that we're virtually like the only country in the world to have a debt ceiling. So I'm on the side of it being pretty ridiculous. I don't think that we're somehow like an exemplar nation that we have one. Instead, I think it's like this weaponized political thing that enables what we're seeing right now to happen as far as like two people or two sides like vying over using this as a weapon to get what they want, and and risking the credit worthiness of the country as a result. So yeah, I would say that it's just a bad idea. I don't think that we should have it. But I think the part of the problem, or like the big part of the problem here, is even the way that we refer to the national debt, the way that we think about what the deficit means. And as long as we are thinking about these things in the way that we are, there's going to be more of an argument for people to believe that we should have a, national debt ceiling if they think of like the national debt as this like big scary uh household debt kind of situation where it's like, oh my gosh, like we're in $30 trillion worth of debt. This is unsustainable, like that kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, if people better understand what the national debt is and what deficits are, um, I think that scariness goes away, and you're more concerned about other real things like economic capacity, resources, technology, these kinds of things.
So I
Well,
often say the debt is the money supply. And I know a lot of people are now saying like the debt is really just the accumulated wealth. A lot of times when you start thinking like that, it's tough to bridge the divide from the people who do see it as like a mortgage, because I constantly ask myself, well, who are we paying back? Like, who do we owe this money to, right?
Right. Yeah. This idea of even owing and calling it debt is just it's kind of weird. Like
Yeah, it
imagine
is.
if like let's say when we go to a bank and we deposit money into a savings account, Like the bank doesn't panic about how many people
Are
have
doing that.
how
Yes.
deposited money, right? They're like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, we owe, $10
All
billion
of these
dollars.
people. Yeah. That's a great way to look at it. Yes.
Like it's just weird. They're not going to think about it that way. So it's more of an asset. It's like a government backed, government created, government issued asset instead of a debt. And the origins of it is kind of weird too. So like let's start with deficit. So a deficit is really just the amount of money that we spend more than we tax. So it's the distance between how much we spend and how much we tax. And if we don't tax as much as we spend, then that's the deficit. Now, we then choose to issue treasury securities one for one when we run a deficit. And the question then is like, why do we do that? Um, One is
My
because it's super
yeah.
popular.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Like
My answer would be to sop up purchasing power, but go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. That I would say that like that's part of the logic too. The thinking is okay. So if we have not taxed, let's say the deficit of 500 billion. So if we have not taxed 500 billion out of the economy that we spent into it, then we've essentially increased the money supply by 500 billion. So then the thinking is, well, let's let's freeze 500 billion worth of dollars so that people don't spend it, so that we don't see inflationary pressure. So then how do we do that? Well, let's actually incentivize people to actually deposit their money, and then we'll give them these little certificates in exchange that bear interest. And then so that's the incentive, is that people can safely put their money somewhere and then they'll gain interest on it by not spending it. So there's like this inflationary kind of thinking behind it. But then again, also it's just very popular. Like one way of thinking about this is that, let's say a normal person deposits their money in a bank and they're limited to $250,000. That's the FDIC insurance. So if you've got $1 million and you want to deposit your money in a safe way, then treasury securities are where it's at. Backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, you know that if you deposit that money in a treasury security, that you will earn that interest, and in a way that you can't do at an FDIC insured bank because they stop at $250,000.
Right. Yeah. So it's a safe investment. Since you want to
Right.
ask something else about the debt ceiling,
Well, no, regarding the
gold standard.
no, the treasury bonds and stuff. So like just to be clear, when they decided to do that, it was definitely intentional to say we want to help stop inflation. That was definitely their thought process.
Yeah, the thinking is to offset the
Right.
deficit. Yeah.
Right. So, but, I mean, people would be a lot less hostile to the debt and the deficit if that's the way it was framed. Like this is a thing, this is a weapon against inflation, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. That's really the way to really think about all spending in general, I think, is that it's not about trying to come up with like some amount of money in order to spend stuff. It's
Mhm.
that we can spend whatever we want to. We create the currency. There is no limit to the money. But what matters is actually the inflationary forces. And that
Right.
depends on economic capacity, technology, natural resources, the people, the workers, the skill that they have. All these things actually matter to the economy far more than like these coming up with dollars. Like
Mhm.
it's a very rudimentary kind of um, estimate of like kind of resources and these things. Like it has a purpose. It really is helpful to have dollars, but we've come to think that dollars are like they come first, but they don't. We just create them and then we tax out money that we spend, and then what matters is the actual economy, what we can buy with those dollars.
Yeah. The
Mhm.
resources and the
Right.
resources. I mean, it's especially now that we're in like a technologically based economy. Like it really seems like the sky is the limit with the resources. I'm always arguing with the leftist side of the equation that, can't fathom the fact that, you can create infinite products and services out of a finite number of resources. So the resource resources being finite is not the limitation to the economy at this point.
Yeah. Like, imagine if like we could create some infinite amount of food with a say digital food. Like it's not possible, but let's just say that we could, and there's no limit to that. So in which case there's actually no limit to the amount of let's say food tickets or something that you could give to people or to buy that, because there'd be no inflation from that, because however much food people wanted, they could get it with however unlimited amount of food tickets go. So what matters is what is actually scarce. What matters is the time it takes to create something, how much we can create it, the logistics of getting it from here to there. All that stuff is what matters. And then as we become more as things become more abundant through technology, it actually makes increasing sense to actually make sure that people have spending power in order to buy the stuff that all this technology is making possible.
Sitch, I don't want to cut you off. So,
so I guess the question I wanted to ask was, so like right now, obviously with our our money's not pegged to anything, so the government can just create it, and so there are certain rules that apply to that. And I was wondering that when we were on the gold standard, like the rules around the debt ceiling, did they make more sense because, or I guess under the gold standard, like, okay, let me rephrase this. People's problem, I guess, with the debt is that they perceive it like the government has to acquire our money to pay for things, essentially. And currently that's not the case because government can just print money. But was that true under the gold standard because they did have to have gold to back up whatever they were creating?
Well, I think there's probably more of an argument than there is now. I don't think there's any argument right now to do this. And then with the gold system, then it is weird that we kind of tied our own hands behind our backs and said, we can't spend on, let's say, highway infrastructure or something unless we come up with enough gold first, kind of thing, or we have enough to back it. Like,
Right.
It really was very limiting. And so that could also be why there was less reason to even have a national debt. And again, I don't like calling it that, but
what should we call it?
A national surplus.
How should we reframe it?
Yeah, the national debt is actually like the private sector surplus. You can think of it that way, or you can think of it as government created securities, something like that. But yeah, there's no like popular way of talking about it in a way that has caught on and it helps people like understand it better. It's just,
should we call it the national
ingrained.
money supply? Would that be better?
Yeah, I think that helps too, to think of it as the money supply, where like, yeah, if we actually, because when people say, oh, everyone owes together $31 trillion, that's the national debt, and we should, everyone owes this amount, and if we paid off $31 trillion, then that would be like fiscally responsible or whatever. But if you did that, then you would actually tax out essentially all of the money in the private sector. All of the money that there would be to use to spend on goods and services would be like gone. And then also at the same time, we would actually be getting rid of all treasury securities. So there would be, no safe way for people to gain interest on stuff, which means that would heavily impact, things like pension funds and stuff like that heavily invests in treasury securities. So again, treasury securities are really popular. And if you were to like ask a member of Congress, even if they think that we should get rid of the national debt, they would say yes. And then if you said that same person, do you think we should get rid of all treasury securities? They would say no.
Even though they're the same thing.
Even though the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a service that the United States offers. Not many people think of it that way. Go ahead, Sitch.
Someone asked, what should be the limit on infinite government spending? Maybe a rule like no spending past 3% of the GDP, or an anticipated inflation beyond something like 2%, although predicting inflation is hard.
Yeah, when we kind of step back and unattach ourselves from this belief that money is finite and stuff, then we start asking better questions. And these questions are like, what is the best kind of optimal rate of inflation? Um,
But before
what
we
kind
go
of
there, can we just lay out what inflation is specifically, just because people have
Sure.
different ideas of that. What causes inflation? Like a lot of people believe they're from the Austrian school and they believe
Yeah.
just any increase in money supply is basically all the goods and services, you know, being spread out against more money and therefore the money is worth less.
Yeah, I mean, people think of inflation in terms of how it impacts them as rising prices. I
Correct.
think that's
Yeah.
a good way of thinking about it is if there's inflation, it's because stuff that you buy or need is getting more and more expensive, and that rate of increase is inflation. But it's not as simple as being like, oh, it's when demand exceeds supply. It's when too much money supply is in the economy. And we've
Right.
we've printed too much money, so there's too many dollars chasing the same amount of goods. Like those are kind of semi-accurate, but not entirely the true full picture. And so even when we're looking at like what just happened, during the pandemic, like we created a lot more money through federal spending that was through federal deficit spending, and also the Fed created a lot of money through buying essentially to buying securities straight off, or assets and securities straight off the market, and it just created money to do that. Like we created that money, and so one simple story is saying, well, because we did that, then that's the reason for all of the inflation. Um, but it's only partially the reason. So, like the Federal Reserve looked at this and they estimated that about 3 percentage points out of the 9.1 percentage point peak was due to deficit spent stimulus money, and then the rest of it was other factors. So these other factors that are important are like we had a pandemic, and so we had we switched from like a really mostly like a services economy to kind of mostly like a goods economy for a temporary point. So there was where we'd usually spend on goods and services, we basically stopped spending on services or spend a lot less, and then we spent a lot more on goods. So that way we exceeded the capacity for goods. That was an issue. And then of course we had the supply chains from the global supply chain. So all of this pressure, all this demand for goods was just too much for the supply chain to handle. So that's why you had these boats offshore full of cargo that they just couldn't unload, so that like the stuff existed and it was there for people to actually consume, but like it couldn't actually get to people. There were these bottlenecks. And when you start to see stuff like that, then you realize that, part of actually paying for something is to actually reduce those bottlenecks. It's to actually make sure that we don't exceed capacity by actually growing our total capacity and making sure that we don't have these kind of obstacles and barriers to doing this stuff. And then there's also the impacts of the oil shock. So Putin invades Ukraine, and as a result, oil skyrockets. The price of oil skyrockets, and part of that is kind of like betting that there'll be oil issues, which can result in higher prices. And part of it is, the simple fact that there was a reduction in supply because the rest of the world started to say, we're not buying any more oil from Russia. So oil prices then shift into everything, which then raises prices overall. So then that's part of the story as well. And then you have corporations who use the cover of inflation to be like, well, everyone knows that prices are going up, so let's just like raise prices a bit more. Let's increase profits. Let's take this opportunity to do that. So then that
And
was
there's
part of the
nothing
story
wrong
too.
with that, of course, right? I mean, obviously, supply and demand, right? Well, see, this is where like my capitalist
So
side kind of comes out. They're in business. There is always, what will you want to maximize profits. So an opportunity like this, you can kind of test what will the market bear, right?
yeah, but I know at the same time too. I'm from New Orleans,
Mm-hmm.
and I look at like should profiteering exist within like hurricane
Profiteering,
conditions.
such a dirty word.
Well, the definition of profiteering is just being like you claim excessive profits because of extraordinary temporary circumstances.
Right.
Mhm.
And
Well,
so,
that's obviously
is that something?
an extreme case, and I guess you could make the argument the pandemic is obviously an extreme case. So
And also the case too is war. So, war profiteering is the way you think about it. So,
yes,
in war conditions, should corporations be making a lot more profits because of, how war could impact the supply of things?
sure.
Like,
But
I can't believe you're such a war profiteer, Adam.
look,
Jeez. Like,
these terms. Look, I feel like there's good arguments on both sides of that. Obviously, not in the war profiteering, but if you talk about, obviously the libertarians will make an argument about, charging outrageous amounts of money for generators during a flood in New Orleans will incentivize people to bring generators to New Orleans from everywhere in the world to make a tidy profit. And what they really need is generators. So is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, I don't
if you're
know.
buying up all the resources in the area, of course it's a bad thing. If you're
If you're
bringing in new resources, that's a different question.
right, if you're monopolizing resources in the
Right.
yeah.
area, that's
See,
yeah,
that's a key too.
yeah.
That's a really important key here
But
is that
this is why the
again,
details are so important
yeah, right. And
around inflation as well. Yeah, to
But it's
go
also I would even combine that too as a component of the inflationary story, where if you don't have as much competition, then you're actually able to raise prices more than you otherwise would in a very competitive market.
right.
So that's something too. Whereas if we make markets more competitive, if we actually fight monopolies and have policies that try to create competition, then that can actually lower prices. In which case, we have more economic capacity than we otherwise would.
Yeah, you lay that out in your book about economies of scale obviously bring prices down. So my broader point about bringing up inflation is just it really is, you have to look at the details of the situation, because you can get inflation in certain areas of the economy and not get inflation in other areas of the economy. Obviously, like eggs are super expensive right now because there was some sort of bird flu that killed off 30% of the chickens. So they don't
Yeah,
have the eggs, but a lot of people are obviously taking this opportunity when it's totally unrelated to stimulus spending to say, "Oh my God, this stimulus spending was crazy. Eggs are through the roof." But
yeah, and
it's
that's
only eggs.
also
Gas is cheaper than it has been in months.
yeah, that's also where like the left right kind of conversation can really distort the conversation. Like I think it was Robert Reich who I think it was him who recently like said something about how egg producers are profiteering, with like
Yes, he
how much
did.
more expensive things are, and it's like okay, like this is an example where eggs, people really should know that there was a bird flu and that part of this is the government mandates that you cull these chickens. And so, we killed like 50, 60 million chickens. Yeah, like I said, huge percentage of the total chicken supply for laying eggs. And so, yeah, you're going to have fewer eggs. And so it makes sense to charge more for those eggs. Like that makes total sense. In which case, they should do that.
Yeah. Robert Wright did a tweet it's Robert Reich, I think, did a tweet saying that the chicken industry was profiteering off of this. And I retweeted it and said, Robert lied, chickens died, which is obviously
Oh yeah.
a callback to the Bush lied, people died. So, but so so now that we understand inflation, I told you before the stream, I was reading this book, Money for Nothing, or why we should stop worrying about debt and learn to love the Federal Reserve. It's a MMT book, and I'm on a quest for an MMT book that I can recommend to people that's just not completely left-wing, partisan, off the charts. I
Mhm.
thought this book was going to be that book, but then the second half of the book kind of went off the rails. And I know that the MMT people and the UBI people are kind of at odds. A lot of MMT people are in favor of something called a jobs guarantee program because they don't believe that you can do MMT and UBI, because if you do UBI, no, basically nobody will show up to work.
Right.
So the metaphor that I told you a little bit about before the stream in the book is actually great, that they set up in the very beginning. So they talk about extensively about lending and spending, which is the source of the money supply, right? The banks lend and that creates money,
Mhm.
and the government spends and that creates money. And if you go into the productivity story where you're trying to basically, in order not to get inflation, you're trying to balance productivity with the money supply, right? That's the whole goal of the Fed, is to stabilize prices and to have full employment, the
Right.
dual mandate of the
Yeah.
Fed.
Dual mandate.
So in lending, I understand that lending, when you lend money, the person taking the money is making a promise to add productivity to the private sector. And the arrangement is, obviously I'm going to make enough money to pay back the loan, and I'm going to make a surplus amount of money. Otherwise, why would I be taking the loan? So in order to make a surplus amount of money in a capitalist economy, obviously you have to create goods and services that people want, which you would define as productivity, raising that GDP. So, and spending is buying productivity, right? You're basically saying, I need you to, I need police to produce safety. I need fire departments to produce, security. I need judges to produce safe property rights. So you're spending money for productivity in kind of a quid pro quo way. The problem that I have with UBI, and I mean, you make some great arguments in favor of this, is I don't know. UBI, you're giving people money, but you're not, that productivity commitment is not in the UBI equation at all. How does giving somebody money convert to productivity? And I'll just, in good faith, I'll give you, I think, one of the best arguments already on the table is there's a lot of unpaid labor in the economy. If a woman is raising 5 kids, those 5 kids are going to add a whole lot of productivity to the economy. And, you're not paid a dime to raise 5 kids, right? So I think a UBI, you could make an argument that if it starts people creating stable families, then that could be an increase in productivity. But
Mhm.
I'll let you take the floor.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say that part of the issue here is trust, and it's like a lack of trust. It's like we have an economy based on distrust, and a UBI economy would actually be built on trust. And right now we really don't have a lot of trust. I mean, we're actually
Right.
trust is
Yeah.
going down over time. Trust in society, trust in each other. So it's actually becoming more and more difficult to trust each other. But and this is what the data shows. This is what like basic income experiments show, is that productivity does not go down. People don't start working less, except in specific groups, like, for example, new mothers, especially, and like, for example, students. And I wouldn't argue that either of those things are working less. I would argue that that's a different kind of work that actually doesn't pay money.
Well, let's
But
see. This is where I don't know, because, like, if I got UBI in my 20s, I don't know that I would have committed to any productivity whatsoever, right? I just would have been surfing and drinking.
well, yeah. So again, overall, and this is we can like share in the show notes or something a systematic review of basic income studies. This is looking at dozens of programs, and
Okay.
showed that overall employment actually increases on net, and we've seen this like over and over again. So to assume that productivity goes down just isn't the case. Like what happens is that some people can choose to do less paid work, but then the people who aren't able to find paid work, the people who want paid work, can then actually find that paid work that they weren't actually able to do before. And that basic income actually helps connect people to the labor market. The Stockton pilot, that was a recent pilot in Stockton, California, that showed that one of the key results was that full-time employment doubled among recipients of basic income compared to the control group. And so, like an anecdote that goes along with this to kind of understand how that happens is that one person um, was able to not go into work one day and was able to go and go to a different job interview for a better job. And so they got that job. And so if without the basic income, then they couldn't have afforded to take a day off, an unpaid day off, in order to take that risk of getting the better job. And we see that kind of effect over and over again. It's also why I think entrepreneurship is such like a big impact when we look at basic income experiments, where there's just like a lot of people who want to start their own business, but they lack the capital. They're afraid of what happens if they fail. And basic income actually provides people the capital and provides people this reduced risk aversion. They feel like, well, if I fail, at least I'm going to be okay. I've got this financial floor underneath me. And also basic income in like fully like universal kind of saturation pilots provides money to the rest of the community, which is then actually able to afford whatever businesses start up in that community. So like over and over again, it's just not accurate to think that basic income somehow hurts productivity. And that's where the I think where the MMT people end up preferring job guarantees so much in general over something like UBI, because again, this logic from MMT says, all right, the issue is inflation. And so if we're going to give people money, then we need to make sure that we can create more stuff. So what we want to do is essentially make people make more stuff. And that way, and we don't see inflation because productivity has increased at the same time as giving people this money. But that argument, this kind of belief is based on this, oh, people will stop working when it doesn't. Mosler has this explanation. People who know MMT would know him. He talks about how like he has, and I mentioned this in my book too, where he has these business cards and he has kids and he says, all right, here kids, if you want stuff, then you need to do chores in order to get these cards. Like I'll give you these cards in exchange for these chores. And then you'll have this, like, he creates this currency essentially. Like they had no interest in the business cards if they weren't able to buy stuff with it. But then by saying, all right, you can buy stuff and you needed chores to get them, then now they're actually being more productive and doing what he wants them to do. And voila, he's created money and more productivity. But then my critique to that is saying, well, what he didn't do was say that if you don't do these chores, then you're going to not have any food and you're going to need to sleep outside. Like
Right.
he made sure that his kids at least have their basic needs met. And then what they're doing is doing chores in order to do stuff like for extra. Like they want time to play Xbox. They want this other like luxury kind of thing. That they're not doing this for food and shelter. And so that's why I would say that basic income is just recognizing that same thing. It's saying that let's make sure people have their basic needs met. And that actually enables them to pursue things in the labor market or pursue unpaid work. It actually enables them to do stuff. And you're no longer saying you can't eat unless you do what I want you to do.
It seems like from a social science perspective, though, there needs to be some study to find out how many people will just drop down to, living off of the basics and not really aspire to work to obtain the luxuries. Because at the same time, you're still going to have people that have to do jobs that nobody wants to do,
Yeah. And that's where
which,
supply and demand comes in. Like
okay.
that's one of the reasons I really like basic income too, is because this actually kind of accomplishes what a minimum wage does in a different way. So the minimum wage says, well, we have to set a floor on the wage price, and a business can't has to have pay at least this much to someone per hour.
Right.
And basic income says, all right, well, you have this starting amount of money, and that's unconditional. You now have more bargaining power. So if you want to not work, then that actually means wages and salaries will need to rise on stuff that people don't want to do. And that stuff that people really want to do could actually potentially pay less. So if there's a very meaningful job that people want to do, this also works for volunteering, but this also works for more jobs that are, say, more purposeful or meaning filled. They would need to raise their wages and salaries like they would under, say, like a minimum wage. People could actually choose to do that because they want to.
You made a
But
great
there's like
point.
that flexibility on both sides.
You made a great point in the article, which I think completely gets the human psychology right, about how somebody will do a job for no money that they love. And as soon as you pay them for it, then all of a sudden they hate the job. It's like
Right.
they don't want to do it at all. Like you'll have these volunteer caregivers who just enjoy the bejesus out of it, going in and doing something helpful in their community. And then as soon as you pay them minimum wage, they're like, oh, I hate this place. I never want to come back again. So I do.
Yeah.
The arguments that you make for getting people into the right situation, I think is helpful. But I just, like, all of society is structured around avoiding the free rider problem. And I wonder how many people would become free riders and not really care to even participate in the system. Like right now, we have a certain amount of productivity that is being produced through the stick. And I do admit exactly what you're saying. Like, it's, you're going to work or you're going to go live under the bridge. So it is a stick. UBI completely takes the stick off the table. So you're creating an economy that only works because people are incentivized to work. And I just like, is there a way to test those numbers to find out?
Well, okay, yeah, okay. So there are some multiple surveys that I've seen that asked about this in regards to basic income, and I've seen it around 4% in multiple surveys.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say
4% will
4%
not work.
Will not work. And this is working age population, of course, not like, kids and seniors and stuff who already don't work, or those with disabilities.
Right.
So we could think of it like that. But then this is a good opportunity too, to point out the difference between the UBI system and the current conditional welfare system, the current safety net. And so what we're doing right now, let's say if you're temporarily unemployed, then you receive unemployment as long as you remain unemployed. So the condition to receive the assistance is to not get a job. If you get the job, then you lose the unemployment income and you just have your wage income. So that's the decision. Let's say it can be, especially looking at a part-time job. Let's say you're getting $1,000 a month in unemployment income. You get a job offer for $1,000 a month. And so now you lose the unemployment income, you gain the wage income, and now you're working all these hours for zero benefit.
Yeah.
You should have just remained unemployed.
Yeah, the incentives for welfare is just insane. So
right. And with a basic income, you would be, let's say, $1,000 per month. You get the $1,000 per month job offer. You go from $1,000 a month to $2,000 a month. Like, that's the incentive, is to actually be better off. And so the existing system doesn't have that. That's just the unemployment system. Welfare, of course, is designed the same way, where instead of being temporarily unemployed, you have a sufficiently low income, in order to maintain your welfare assistance, you have to maintain that low income. And same kind of choice. Like effectively, what we're doing is the existing system has really high marginal tax rates on the people with lowest incomes. And so then it's funny how when people, let's say the same kind of person who will worry about the rich person not working if we raise their marginal tax rate 10% beyond what it is right now, that same person won't worry or recognize or will judge someone who's poor facing a marginal tax rate of 80%, 90%, or even beyond 100% and call them lazy. Why don't you get a job? Well, it's like, well, you're facing a really high marginal tax rate if you do that. So that's really the difference is the current system actually has this structure that disincentivizes employment, disincentivizing earning income, and the basic income doesn't have that. So I think that's part of the reason also why we see these employment increases when we compare basic income systems to control groups with the existing setup. Finland did that too, actually. They actually took a group of 2,000 unemployed people, and the control group continued receiving the traditional unemployment assistance in Finland. Is around $600 per month. And the basic income recipients got to keep that income when they accepted employment. So the result of that was that employment went up a bit in Finland as a result of that among those recipients, because it's just a better incentive structure.
So they kept the UBI and then took a job. Well,
and they combine.
I do think. I mean, I do think a lot of people do desire to work anyway. So that's the question that I have. I do know that there are people though, obviously, that, would just live off the UBI and not work. So 4% is an interesting number. I'll have to look into that more. Sitch, you have any questions?
Well, I know
we have a bunch of super chats. So
whenever we would talk about UBI, one of the classic counter responses would be, well, if everyone gets $1,000 a month in the country or in a city, that the rent will just rise by some equivalent amount, or food will just rise by some equivalent amount, and basically it'll just be inflated away and thus become, meaningless. Is that a real concern, or?
So this also ties back into what we were talking about earlier too about inflation in general. So part of this discussion is what taxes are we pairing with the UBI, if any? Like if you don't have any taxes along with the basic income, then your deficit spending, you're actually creating a larger money supply in order to fund it. That's going to have like your maximum inflationary impact. That's not to say that it will 100% increase inflation even that way, but that is the most pressure from an inflationary perspective. And then what you could also do is do like a revenue neutral UBI, which means that you are matching the amount of spending with taxation. And then that's not going to have an inflationary impact from the money expansion viewpoint. But then also what matters is what tax are you actually using? So, you're going to see different impacts based on, let's say, if you're doing a traditional income tax, if you're doing a consumption tax, and if you're doing something like a carbon tax or land value tax, all these other different kinds of taxes you could potentially do. So when it comes to housing, I would really like to see like a land value tax paired with a UBI as part of this because of the incentive structure of that too. What you're doing is you're making it more expensive to sit on like a vacant property, a vacant lot, and you're incentivizing them to actually develop that so that that's an incentive to create more housing. Because again, what we want is if we want cheaper rent, then we need more housing built in places where people want to live. And part of that story too, from a UBI perspective, is if we are providing a basic income to people nationally of the same amount, then you're actually creating this incentive where that money is going to go further in an area with cheaper cost of living. So it may make more sense for someone who right now has to have a job in a city because where the jobs are, and instead maybe they can move to more of a rural USA and like rebuild the small town, Main Street USA, small businesses and these kinds of things, um, because suddenly there would be more customers in those areas. So in that way, you could actually see deflationary pressure on rents in cities and potentially more expensive rents in more rural areas, which we actually basically saw a version of recently during the pandemic when people moved away from cities because of flex work and being able to work from home, and they moved to cheaper areas. So that's another impact. Um, and then one other thing, as far as like housing supply and rents and these things go, is that we saw this even in the guaranteed income experiments when Nixon almost passed it in the 70s here in the US, where we tested this in multiple cities, and we saw that home ownership rates went up. So even though this was a temporary pilot, people knew that they weren't going to get the money permanently. They were only going to get it for a matter of years. They went ahead and got, 30-year mortgages at higher rates than they would have otherwise. So people, want to be homeowners, but they don't have the money to afford to buy the homes. And then so they're stuck in the rental market. And then that gives landlords more power to raise rents. And if we had a basic income, I would expect that another component of this, another impact would be that there would be more homeowners. So that would reduce the pressure on rents as a result.
That's
Hmm.
that's a
That makes
great
sense.
point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
I didn't even
and
know.
landlords would be less. I mean, there would be little risk in taking on tenants that had UBI because obviously they can pay the rent. They got the UBI.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, like right now we have, Section 8 housing assistance, these housing
Sure.
vouchers. And one of those problems there is this is like a program that um, only 25% of people who qualify for actually get. And so you're not, the coverage is bad, and then the locations are limited to where the landlords will accept it. Most landlords don't accept it. And so you're limited to certain areas of town with certain landlords who will accept it. Whereas the basic income, now the same thing, it's cash. So yeah, any landlord will accept cash. They have no idea of knowing, whether it's basic income or whether your salary or wages or whatever, because it's the same thing. It's cash.
We have a
Mhm.
bunch of super chats, and we have about 30 minutes before the other guest comes in. Sitch, do you want to read? There's a bunch of UBI super
Uh,
chats.
well, there's some UBI detractors who say UBI is already being done in the US. Go to Venice Beach or the Tenderloin in California. Homeless people get $650 a month plus free food and free shelter. They get addicted to hard drugs and never seek help.
That's the 4% we're talking about, right, Scott?
Well, okay, so two things come to mind with that, and one is there's also meta-analyses that look at the impact on drugs and alcohol, and interestingly, it goes down too. And this can be seen, this makes sense if you look at this from like a self-medication perspective. Like if you are living a very stressed out, life, if you really look at like I just need to numb the pain kind of thing, then that's when you get into using drugs, and alcohol is this kind of self-medication. That's not true for everybody. It's true for a good amount of people. It's also, I think, part of the reason for like the opioid crisis. Um, when you give people an unconditional cash, then you would expect that they would use it on drugs. But instead, because they feel this like greater security, then they're not as stressed. They know it's going to come, they know it's going to be there the next month, the next month, the next month. Then they actually reduce their spending on that. It's actually been another result from the Stockton experiment was that it was equivalent to a mental health impact of antidepressants. Um, I think that's a pretty impressive deal. And again, over and over again, I've seen this reduction in drug usage. So it's like one of those things where sure, some people will start using drugs that wouldn't have otherwise done it, but on net, a lot more people would reduce their drug and alcohol usage um, as a result. And then the other thing I would say is we actually do have a basic income in the U.S. in a state, but it's in Alaska. So when people ask, has basic income been tried anywhere? That's really like the only place that has done it, especially in a really long-term way.
Hmm.
So every year since 1982, Alaska has issued a national or a statewide dividend that goes to every person. So every child, every adult, rich or poor, everyone in Alaska who's been there a resident for 1 year and wasn't imprisoned the previous year, or currently in prison, receives that dividend. And so, it's really interesting to look at the results of that, like, because this is a really long-term thing. What has the result of that been? Um, One of the results is that part-time work actually increased by 17% as a result of the dividend. And they looked at full-time work, and they saw that that full-time work among certain individuals went down. But then because of the extra spending that the rest of the community had, then that created new jobs, which other people took. So there was no increase or decrease in full-time employment, but there was that 17% increase in part-time employment. And then there's some other impacts there too. I think it's interesting that that child obesity rates went down, and that children are born with healthier birth weights due to better maternal nutrition, and that things like um, crime can actually be temporarily impacted in reductions through property crime after a payout. So there's
Oh,
really
wow.
there's multiple impacts, yeah, that are interesting to learn from Alaska. But I wouldn't point to any kind of welfare program as being basic income, because again, the design is entirely different. I like to point out the difference is saying that, let's say welfare pays you to do nothing, but basic income pays you to do anything. Like the incentive there is to not increase your income under a welfare scheme,
Hmm.
whereas basic income says you can do anything you want and keep the basic income. You can do unpaid work, you can accept part-time job, you can accept full-time job, anything, it's up to you, and you can keep the basic income as a bonus.
It sounded like you were against income tax. You lay out an argument that taxing is a way to rid ourselves of things that we don't want in society. And if we want to incentivize people to work, income tax is the wrong way to do it, which I mean, I agree with.
Yeah, I think that taxation should be looked at as an incentive structure. There's also the let's say the psychological view of things too. So let's say Social Security is a good example of this. So like from the kind of MMT perspective, there's the way Social Security works is that the government is spending the money on Social Security recipients. They're getting the payment. It's brand new money. And then what we're doing is removing money from the economy by reducing the consumption ability of workers through the payroll tax. And that can, from like an MMT perspective, that okay, like what you're doing is saying we want to make sure that everyone can afford the basics, and that when you're a senior, you are no longer contributing to productivity and creating those basics. So in order to avoid inflationary pressure, then let's reduce the consumption ability of those who are consuming so that seniors will have that ability without increasing inflation. Like that's the kind of accurate depiction of the way Social Security works. But there's this psychological element to Social Security, which is even behind the design itself when it was created, where the thinking was if people perceive that they're putting their money like in a lockbox, and then they're getting their money back, then you will protect the program. Like people will not stand for someone getting rid of Social Security when it's their money. It's my money that's been put away. So there's that kind of psychological kind of argument to look at this too. When it comes to income taxes, like, yeah, I think if we have a whole slew of taxes we can do, then let's actually do the ones with the incentives that we want. And income tax, there might be an argument from a psychological perspective of having that, but like maybe it could be small. It could be a lot smaller than it is. Maybe what we could do is just use it as like high marginal tax rates at the top. So let's say, if you can have a low tax rate until you reach, or even a zero tax rate until you reach, say, $1 million, 5 million, 10 million or something dollars of income. And then we start taxing income at that, kind of discourage, accumulating too much money based on like what we think of as too much money as a society. Like that's like something we can do with an income tax. But for like behavior things, I like the land value tax. I like the consumption tax. Like I like the way a very tiny transaction tax works on like every single transaction. Like let's just drain a little bit of money out with every transaction that we do to make room for future spending.
Yeah.
And that way it's just tiny and negligible.
The getting rid of the tax return system would be just awesome.
There's no reason for it to be that complicated as it is now either.
It's such a drain. You're the thing in your book too, just pointing out like the productivity waste in our system, because a lot of people who are against UBI the immediate response is okay, but the private sector has all of this, magical productivity. And I mean, all the things that you're pointing out in your book, I'm going, this is the magical productivity of the private sector, right? We're going to devote all of this time and energy to paperwork and just kind of just meaningless stuff. So
yeah. So let's talk about David Graeber's bullshit jobs argument. Because again, like I think that's a very strong argument just in general that people need to be aware of. Because even there's this kind of like belief from a free market perspective that the free market does not create jobs that don't need to exist. That's like what the government does. That's what a federal job guarantee would do, is create jobs that necessarily don't necessarily need to exist.
Well,
but
people will often frame it as they understand it in the government sector. The government sector always creates jobs that shouldn't exist, and I'm just like, well, yeah, so does the private sector. Haven't you worked in private sector jobs where you're like, okay, well, this is just ridiculous. So continue.
Yeah. So David Graeber's thesis is that he defines bullshit jobs as a job that someone would self-define as being useless. So it's not that someone is determining that someone else's job is bullshit. It's that the person in that job recognizes it as being entirely unnecessary. And, a lot of us can even do bullshit work in a non-bullshit job. And then there's even real jobs that exist because of bullshit jobs. So like in David Graeber's book, one of the things he mentions is, let's say, the janitorial staff of a building full of jobs that don't need to exist. So if you have all these jobs that don't need to exist, they require other jobs. And those jobs may be real, but all these other jobs are unnecessary. And I look at this too, also from like an automation perspective, where there are estimates that about half of all tasks could be automated using existing technology. So this is even before getting into ChatGPT and all of the things that are coming down the pipe. But like just what we could actually do right now if we really, really wanted as a society to automate like as much as we could of human labor. And so from that perspective too, how many jobs are there that don't need to exist based on the technology that we already have to get rid of it? From my perspective, I don't think that we should be doing any work that's unnecessary or could be done by a machine that's necessary. Like, let's actually create a society where the work that we're doing is the stuff that really needs to be done and the stuff that we really want to do. And it's actually leading more into intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, where people are actually, being better fit to the jobs that they will be much more passionate about. And and these jobs that require extrinsic motivation actually apply more extrinsic motivators, as in pays more in order to do it. But yeah, so from an inflationary perspective too, these bullshit jobs are completely reducing our economic, our total economic capacity. If you've got however many millions of people, spending 8 hours a day doing entirely unnecessary work that doesn't need to exist, then they could be doing other things that would be far more productive
Yeah,
to society.
that's an
And then
inflationary force right there
right,
too.
right. And so
They're getting money and being a drain on productivity.
right. So then the question that David Graeber, so he has this whole book and he talks about and defines all these bullshit jobs, provides all the examples, really fleshed out the theory. And at the end, it's like, well, okay, what do we do? Like, how do we actually solve for this problem? And his solution is basic income. And of course, he even looked at, like a job guarantee as being just really what you don't want to do. This is kind of also the
government
apocryphal
gets in the
story.
business of creating bullshit jobs.
Yeah, I like to like it's an apocryphal story related to Milton Friedman, who he visits like a job site or a construction site, and like the person he was walking with is all like, we employ 1,000 people here, and it's like, well, if you use spoons instead of shovels, you can employ like 10,000 people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, so is the goal like jobs? Like, is that the goal, just to like provide someone money to do something? Or is the goal to actually be as productive as possible? In which case we should drain out the unnecessary jobs. In order to do that, you actually have to make it so that people can self-select. Like if someone with basic income is offered a bullshit job or an actual job that actually is important, and the bullshit job pays more, right now they're going to go with the bullshit job because they need money to live. But if you have that choice between a bullshit job and a real job, thanks to basic income, then you can take that real job that pays less. It could be more meaningful, it's more purposeful, it's necessary. And you'll say no to the bullshit job. So yeah, from a productivity viewpoint, again, I see UBI as necessary in order to drain those out and actually increase automation, which is the other side of this. Like, I want to incentivize that.
Yeah. Godlike Snake for $10 says, Chad, negative income tax versus virgin UBI. So he's basically saying that, and we get this a lot. A lot of people are in favor of the negative income tax because it comes from Milton Friedman, who you like the Milton Friedman example that you give in your book. I might have got it from your book, but I use that example all the time now just because it's so great. I think they were building a tunnel or something, and they were digging with shovels. And Milton Friedman asked, "Why aren't you using heavy equipment? Because, like, look, you're building a tunnel. Get an earth mover out here, right?" And they were like, "Oh, but we're employing all these people." And he's like, well, you should give them all spoons then.
Right.
You can
Spoons for the
employ even
shovels.
more. Yeah. So yeah, I like, and that's an argument that you make in the paper. That's really, I mean, that caught my attention because you are providing a free market incentive for people to automate away bullshit jobs. And as a business person, you're constantly thinking, should I just stick with the person doing it, or should I invest in the automation? If I invest in the automation, it's a big one-time thing. But as soon as it's like you got to raise that wage up to a certain level, the automation makes sense. You're like, okay, well, I'll just do away with that job. UBI immediately forces that wage up, and the incentive to automate just becomes important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Economists call it the reservation wage, where it's the wage that people would withhold their work until they get. And so when it comes to automation, like part of the reason we don't have as much automation as we could is because arguably human labor is too cheap.
Yes.
When it comes to the stuff that we don't want to do, that should pay the most. But instead, the stuff that we don't want to do tends to pay the least.
Yep.
And so even when I look at let's say a trending tweet or something about like oh, look what the results of a $15 minimum wage is. Like, look at this automation that's happening. And it's like, well, great.
That's good. Yeah.
Right. I want more automation. We just have to make sure that we all benefit from it.
Yeah.
And if it costs more to hire people, great. People should be more expensive than robots, unless they're, entirely like highly skilled or doing something that robots can't do.
Right.
Then it'd be paid more. Um, One other thing about the like Milton Friedman and negative income tax. Let's just cover that really quickly. It's funny how people think that Milton Friedman was for a negative income tax and not a UBI, but he was actually interviewed about this before from a UBI advocate, and he was asked directly, what do you think of the basic income? And he said that there are two ways of doing this, accomplishing the same thing, as in, a negative income tax would provide the full payment to those earning $0 and then claw it back via the income tax system. And a basic income would provide everyone the same amount, but it would still achieve that clawback, that phase out through either the income tax system or the consumption tax system or whatever. But the important part is that there's always going to be net recipients and net payers. And whereas like that, if you look at the point of a negative income tax where someone would be getting exactly like $0 of negative income tax, then under the UBI system, that same person would be paying the exact same amount of new tax as they are receiving in basic income. So the net impact is still zero for that person. And the net impact could be the same for the people to the left of that and to the right of that when it comes to the income spectrum. It's just a different way of going about it. I would argue that UBI is still better, especially now, because the negative income tax is effectively a UBI.
It's a lump sum, though, right?
Paired with a phase-out tax. No, it doesn't. It's still a monthly. It's still a monthly income.
No, negative income tax. So wouldn't it be a lump sum, like at the end of the year? Because when you do your income tax and you don't have any money, you get like a lump sum.
Yes, if you think about it that way, then you could think of a UBI in the same way too.
That sounds like a horrible idea to me, though.
So what this would be is this is actually kind of like the way the enhanced child tax credit worked that we just saw. And then so people could opt to have the full amount of the child tax credit at tax time, or they could opt into the monthly checks as an advance.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So yeah, each person got to decide, do I want to get that monthly amount of $250 to $300 per month per kid, or do I want to receive it at the end? And same thing in negative income tax. The negative income tax it would be calculated if you want to have the monthly payment, then it would be estimated based on your previous taxes. You could also add the ability to update it and whatever. But that's also why it's not as good, because it actually is adding this bureaucracy where you're saying, let's actually try to figure out each person's income before, and then let's try to figure out how much their negative income tax should be based on their income. Whereas a UBI only has to do the calculation on the back end. It just says, how much did you earn or spend if it's a consumption tax, how much did you earn? And then this is the calculation for your taxes. And it's just done once.
Right.
And the other issue too is that a negative income tax usually has a higher phase out rate. So like Milton Friedman spoke, his variant was a 50% phase out rate. So that's a 50% marginal tax.
What do you mean by phase out rate?
The phase out rate is that for each amount of money, each dollar that you earn, the amount that you get in negative income tax is phased out.
Right.
So
the more
the
you
full
earn,
amount, the full amount is only for earning $0.
Right.
And then the more you earn, the less you get.
Okay, I got it. So at some point you don't get any negative, you don't get any UBI because you make too much money, basically.
In the negative income tax,
if you're thinking of negative income tax as
right.
UBI, yeah,
right. If you're thinking of negative income tax as UBI, then the negative income tax would phase out down to zero at a certain point.
Right.
And it's usually at like a 50% phase out rate, but it could be lower. Milton Friedman liked 50% because it was simple. So it wasn't necessarily what it would be, but he liked speaking about it in math terms. It's very simple to talk about 50% phase out rate. And a 50% phase out rate is a lower marginal tax rate than welfare recipients are currently facing. So if a welfare recipient is currently facing an 80% marginal tax rate based on the current conditional system, then a 50% is an improvement. And that would mean there's more encouragement of work, there's less discouragement of work, thanks to that phase out rate. But it's still a 50% phase out rate. Whereas a UBI, you could actually flatten that out much more. You could have like essentially, it would be effectively a 10% phase out rate. And again, you could do the NIT in the same way. So they could be identical, but it's just so much easier to just not worry about trying to calculate everyone's specific payment that varies versus just giving the same thing and doing the calculation on the back end.
Right. I just know that the different terms are useful in who you're going to sell it to, who you're talking to.
Yeah. And again, it's funny because people will think,
but yeah.
Yeah. People will think, oh, Milton Friedman, that's my guy. And he was for a negative income tax on a UBI. But again, he was for both. He just spoke about negative income tax.
Sitch, we're down to 10 minutes. Can you help me with these super chats? Are they too incendiary or?
No, well, so a couple people asked this question. I think you already answered it, but maybe if they answer it in simpler terms. But someone was asking, how can you have massive forced economic restructuring with injecting insane amounts of currency, which will bump the wage, which will cause an economic crash if you have UBI?
Okay, so we've already spoken too about how it's not necessarily injecting a whole bunch of new money, especially if you do a revenue neutral UBI, you aren't expanding the money supply at all. You're just changing the amount of income distribution. And besides that, this gets into, again, design principles. So right now, we already are spending a lot on people in a visible form, in the form of tax expenditures. This is stuff like stuff people more familiar with. There's, say, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. These are explicit government subsidies that especially reach those at the bottom. But then there's also the standard deduction. That is a tax expenditure that makes it so that you're not taxing those who are earning less than the standard deduction of around $12,000 something right now. So that's a subsidy. And then you have the home mortgage interest rate deduction. These tax expenditures can actually benefit the top far more than the bottom or the middle. Like the average amount of subsidies for someone with $1 million of income is actually over $30,000 annually in these subsidies. So if we go about basic income, most people seem to talk about, well, let's replace things like SNAP and TANF, these kinds of welfare programs with the basic income. And fine, we can certainly do that, especially when it comes to TANF and SNAP. But when it comes to these tax expenditures, we should replace those too. Like if we have a basic income, there's no reason for the standard deduction. There's no reason for these other tax subsidies. Let's replace those as well. So there's not that spending, all this needed spending that people initially think of. If we think of eliminating certain programs that we do both in the welfare and within the tax code, there's just less necessary. And then another part of this is that the existing system isn't free. Like the cost of child poverty alone is over $1 trillion per year. And so that's extremely expensive. That's something that we pay in terms of, more healthcare costs, more crime, and less productivity, especially down the line as these kids get older. It's just really expensive to not provide, especially like a child allowance. So when it came to the enhanced child tax credit, there were studies of this done about, what's the ROI. And so if we had made that permanent and we spent an extra $100 billion per year on that, what was essentially basic income for kids, then we would have had an ROI of $1 trillion per year, 10 to 1. And so how do we look at like a 10 to 1 ROI as being like expensive? Like it is possible to spend more somewhere in order to save a lot more money than that elsewhere. And I think that's important to recognize as part of the cost of basic income, because again, what matters is resource use and capacity. And it's very resource intensive to do these downstream treatments. Like we should look at as basic income as being like kind of like a vaccine, where let's say it's like the difference between polio vaccine and like iron lungs for all. Like we can treat people with polio with an iron lung, but it's really expensive to wait until they have it and then treat them that way. Whereas what we could do is just avoid people having polio by doing like a cheap vaccine. So I think it's important to see basic income as being this preventative, that we can
Hmm.
actually prevent a lot of unnecessary resource expenditure on all of this stuff, especially when it comes to healthcare and crime. And that would save us like trillions of dollars per year just by reducing all of that expenditure.
Hmm. Well, and as you said, because I don't think people conceptualize it this way, is that if Alaska has been basically doing this in the statewide for 40 years and they haven't had these problems, I mean, isn't that a good test that it's not going to create all this massive inflation, I guess, that people are worried about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also it's interesting at Alaska. It's a um, as a specific example from inflation perspective for two reasons. So for one, just as like an immediate visceral thing, is that every year when the dividend checks go out, sales prop up. So you
Hmm.
have like businesses all over lower their prices in order to attract people to spend their dividend checks at their business instead of someone else's business. And so that's like this, it's easy to understand how, as long as there's competitive forces, you're not going to be raising your prices because you're just going to lose your customers to your competitor. Um, and then on the other hand, there was, if you look at like from kind of macro perspective for Alaska, uh, a popular measurement for inflation is the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. And you can look at the CPI in Alaska, that growth rate, and the CPI of the US. And prior to the beginning of the distribution of the dividend, the CPI growth rate was higher in Alaska than the rest of the US. And then after 1982, the growth rate of CPI in Alaska was slower than the rest of the US. And so that's not to say that the dividend like somehow caused this, but I
Wow.
do think it's a strong argument to say that it didn't cause inflation.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, and also, I guess, so in Alaska, it's 1600 a year, right? It's not 1600, it's not a month,
It
right?
it it varies. Yeah, it's per year is when it's
Hmm.
the distribution goes out.
Right.
But also the amount can vary. The largest one just went out recently. I think it was closer to like $3,000.
Hmm.
Um, and this is for everybody.
Right.
So, if the amount is $2,000 and you've got a household of five, then that's $10,000 per year.
Right.
Could you roll a UBI program out smaller like that just to be conservative about it? Roll
You mean like
out
test it in
six,
in a
yeah,
state
six,
or a city
start
or
with
something?
600 a year maybe, and then up it to 1200 a year. And then, just go from there until you get to $1,000 a month, just so people aren't like, I
Yeah.
mean, it is kind of a big risk just to flip the switch on $1,000 a month for everyone.
Yeah, if we were talking about like actual implementation, like we're writing like a policy of how
Right.
to like, we're passing it, I would have have a phase in over time. Like I wouldn't do the full amount on year one.
Day one. Yeah.
Um, yeah, you do want to phase it in. We even did that with Obamacare too, where there was this phase in over time because you're doing this like big change to a big system. So that's certainly one thing. But I really do like the idea of starting small and going fully universal. And so that's also why I like the idea of starting with, say, a carbon fee and dividend. So that would be a revenue neutral. You're adding a tax to carbon at the point of origin, and therefore oil would get to be more expensive, gas would get to be more expensive, that would be passed on to food and stuff that would be more expensive. But then you take all that money, you match that same amount and provide that as a universal dividend. And if you did that, then those at the bottom two-thirds would actually come away with a larger disposable income um, due to the dividend and the tax. And those at the top would be the ones, because they have the larger carbon footprints, who would have a large a smaller disposable income after that. So again, that's showing that there's a net payer and a net recipient. The bottom and the middle of the net recipients, the top is the net payer, and it reduces poverty, it reduces inequality, and it shows that everyone should receive this. Like the proper way of doing a carbon dividend, I would say, is not to try to target it. Every single person is paying the same amount, the same rate, because of this, and everyone should get the same payment back. It should be equal. But the trick is actually getting something to be like that, fully universal, however small, and get it going.
So you're calling UBI a carbon dividend?
I'm saying a carbon dividend is a UBI.
Okay.
I would like to see a UBI paired with carbon taxes, like an annual rising carbon tax. And so that doesn't necessarily need to be revenue neutral. So, I would just like to do a full basic income and have a carbon tax, an annual rising carbon tax, be part of that. But one way of actually just getting a first initial UBI would be to do this kind of revenue neutral, kind of, I think, more politically feasible start to a basic income.
Yeah. We're trying to figure out how to talk about these things so they're less partisan, less politically charged. It's not even possible. Do you know about the James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian did like a spoof on these feminist journals where they wrote a bunch of articles basically in the feminist jargon that were about nonsense, and they ended up getting in a bunch of them. You haven't heard about that?
Haven't heard this.
Okay. It's interesting.
What does that have to do with
the politics? Well, the interesting part of that I just considered the other day, thinking about this UBI stuff, is they were able to get this, get people to accept them just by using the proper jargon, right?
Right.
And so, and I'm thinking, like, how do I write a book about UBI or MMT in a jargon that doesn't set off all the moral intuitions of people on the right? Like, sooner or later, and I'm fully in agreement that in order to, I fully believe that in order to implement something like this, like, you're going to have to convince some conservatives that this is a good idea. And so many of the people advocating for this, all they want to do is shit on conservatives all day. And it's just like, you're basically, why are you even an advocate? Why are you even in this business if you're not trying to persuade people you politically disagree with?
Right. It's all about the persuasion of people that would disagree with you. Otherwise.
Yes.
A couple things to say to that. First of all, there's been some interesting studies. One of my favorites looked at this as in, like, what language could you use in order that would make people more open to basic income, that think it's a better idea than they would otherwise would using a different framing.
Well, not necessarily. I don't want to frame it as like tricking them through using language. It's like just make them understand it in a way that they're like, oh, okay, I get this.
Right.
Yeah.
But when people say, ask me to simply describe basic income, I like to say it's really simply like the power to say no and the freedom to say yes, like kind of the impact of a basic income. So I say that, like, power to say no means, yes, you can refuse unfair conditions that you don't feel are sufficient, which means higher wages. But freedom to say yes means that you can actually choose the job, choose the form of work that's better for you. And it could be cheaper wage, it could not be. But, like, it's choice. It's like freedom of choice to actually be able to choose that. And so if you're not talking about freedom, then you're less likely to appeal to conservatives, because conservatives really think about really anything in terms of freedom. So if you're able to stress this and you say, yes, basic income actually is freedom. It's freedom to have more choices and to have more power, to have more ability to do what you yourself want, and to be able to say no to people who would want to restrict your freedom of choice, then conservatives are more open to that. Another part of this,
part of the moral intuitions of the conservatives, though, and I mean, liberals have this, but to a lesser extent, is fairness by proportionality. That's the moral intuition that keeps getting triggered. Like the idea that you're receiving something without doing anything. And not only that, they frame it as you're receiving something from somebody else who did do something and you are actually doing nothing. So that is the huge hurdle, that moral intuition. The
Yeah.
freedom argument, everybody's in favor of more freedom, but
Yeah, I think part of that too is I think if people understood it more as like a technological inheritance or a natural inheritance, that would
sure.
help as well. So like
Yeah.
the reason UBI is so popular in Alaska, and they don't even think of it as basic income, they think of it as a dividend. They think of it as
They're sharing
earned.
a natural resource.
Yeah, it's their natural birthright to the
Yep.
natural resources of Alaska that is theirs. And so if you can think about this as theirs, and that's why I think that technology can be helpful. Like if we think of everything that we've built that got us to now, that technology, where we are right now, is an inheritance built on all of the work and all the knowledge and everything that happened long before us that got us to this point. So then there's that technological inheritance argument.
Well,
How,
even in the realm of like artificial intelligence, there's a physical connection because the artificial intelligence is
oh
developed off
yeah,
of your physical data. It technically is yours. Yeah,
you're right, right. Yeah. You've got like ChatGPT that it was trained off of,
yeah,
eventually to be trained off of like all text in human existence,
yes,
And so everything any of us ever written has gone into this to help train it. And so what do we get in return? Like we
yeah.
should see that, yeah, as something that should belong to us. And I got to say too that I think there's something to be said that right now we're even talking about like the fair tax because that was like part of the deal that Kevin McCarthy agreed to with the Freedom Caucus that it's going to go on the House floor to be voted on, that it wouldn't have otherwise been voted on. And so this is like a conservative proposal to to replace our income tax system, like all of it, with a national sales tax. And as part of that proposal is something that they call the prebate or the family consumption allowance.
Hey, Scott, I hate to interrupt, but I'm just gonna let Alex in. Is that you're cool with that, right? Alex says he
Oh,
disagrees with you on a couple things, but I,
yeah,
you're welcome to stick
sure.
around as long as you want. We're talking to Alex about UBI as well, so I'll just let
Yeah.
him in. You go ahead and continue your story.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that I just think it's interesting that if the fair tax were to be passed, and let's not to talk about like if the overall package is a good idea or bad idea as far as like the impacts that has on distribution and taxes and income or whatever, but I just think it's really interesting that a conservative proposal actually contains a UBI as part of it. It would be the prebate would be a monthly prebate to everyone in order to afford the poverty level amount of expenditures of the tax increase. So it would be $279 per month for everyone in the US that registers to get it. And this is a conservative proposal. They're saying that this is a fully unconditional universal amount of money, but no one's talking about it as a basic income. No one's. There would be people who will say, "I hate the idea of the basic income. I love the idea of the fair tax and the prebate."
Well, as soon as you call it basic income, though, it completely kills it because it's the moral intuitions of people are just certain words or buzzwords that are just unsayable. So,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's even how, say, the dividend is more. People are more open to that. It's even why like Andrew Yang ran on what he called the freedom dividend, where you get like the dividend is something that's not income; it feels more earned, and freedom, of course, being something that people that appeals to more people, especially conservatives. Freedom dividend actually was something that people would be open to and liked, who may not have otherwise liked the idea of basic income just because of the name.
so, do you want to pitch your social media or anything? You're welcome to stick around. We're going to talk to Alex a bit, but I figured we scheduled you for an hour and a half. It was great talking to you. You're welcome to come
Yeah,
back
yeah, I
again.
definitely, yeah, I gotta get going
Okay.
soon here, but yeah, I'll just say that I'm on Twitter at Scott Santens,
I put it in
and
the description as well, too,
great,
guys. So,
very long pinned thread of evidence that people can go through and find studies, learn more about like the actual data behind the behavioral evidence for basic income. And I'm on Patreon at Scott Santens. Pretty much anywhere you can find me at Scott Santens. And on my blog at scottsantens.com, you can find my FAQ, read more about a bunch of different questions that people commonly ask, especially probably questions that were asked here that we didn't get to.
Well, I'm sure I'll hit you up in DMs if I have any more questions. And like, I'd love to talk to you again if you're open to it. So,
Yeah, sounds great.
all right. Take care.
Thanks
Thanks,
for coming,
Adam.
Scott.
Thanks, Sitch. See you, Alex.
Hey, Scott. Bye.
Bye.
How you doing today, Alex?
I'm doing good. Yeah. We just got an offer accepted on a house, so
Oh,
I'm
nice.
feeling pretty good right now. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Are you American, Alex?
I'm American. Yes.
All right. So you're familiar with the term the American dream then?
We only allow Americans on here because we're very jingoistic.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the term American dream.
So they don't call homeownership the American dream for nothing. So congratulations, man. You've achieved the American dream.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a little bit mixed because I'm kind of anti, the whole using houses as investments. I want homes to be as cheap as possible for people because I want us to think of homes as places where people live, not like, something that you store your wealth in or something like that. But it's, we're living in the real world and it's good to have a home lined up.
Yeah. I agree with you. I agree with you.
It's our first house. Yeah. So we're super excited.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think homes should be affordable too. We should be stamping those things out like hamburgers, not like treating them like Vincent van Gogh paintings that only an occasional person gets to live in.
Well, it's weird because there's these conflicting incentives, right? There's this idea that you want to protect homeowners and their wealth and everything like that. So it's actually bad when home prices go down, which is, something in our world is broken when that's how we think about things.
Yeah.
True.
So do you want to give, I watched a talk that you had with Econo Boy.
Oh, yeah.
A little bit about your thing. Do you want to introduce yourself and maybe give us like a kind of background? I know you're, a lot of people accuse you, and I think Econo Boy did this, of being like an MMTer. And you're like, no, I have something completely different than MMT. So you want to kind of lay out that argument?
Yeah, so I'm Alex, and I'm not an MMTer. I think I should start by saying that most people agree about most things, but the stuff that we disagree about is the stuff that we see it has the most prominence, and it's what we argue about, and all of that. So I think most schools of economics agree about most things, right? But what matters is the points of difference. MMT does something really cool that I like, which is that they use balance sheets and they get the balance sheets right, they get the accounting right, all of that. I like that about MMT. I'm not on board with their story about the nature of money. So MMT has this story about how, every time I try to describe this, disclaimer ahead of time, someone who's an MMTer comes back and says, no, you don't really understand MMT. It's actually like this. So then I try to incorporate that into my description next time, that kind of thing. So just, putting that out there, my description is not going to be perfect. I'm always learning, etc. But my sense, and I think you're familiar with MMT. Is that right, Adam?
Yeah.
Or
definitely.
Somewhat familiar.
Definitely.
Yeah. So you can be
I'm
the
in
one
the same boat. I always say like, well, I'm not really an MMTer, but I mean, there are certain descriptive aspects of MMT that I think are correct. But you could classify them as classical economics. They're not necessarily MMT. So,
yeah, I think MMT agrees with classical economics and neoclassical economics and Austrian economics on almost everything. But the stuff that matters is the points of difference. So MMT says that money is fundamentally a tax credit. It's something that the government issues and imposes on society as a way of provisioning resources for itself. So the government comes into the economy and says, hey, you need to pay us taxes, and you need to pay us taxes in the form of this particular instrument, this money token thing. And people say, oh, we don't have any of these money tokens. And the government says, oh, well, That's fine, no problem. We are going to be trading these money tokens for labor. So you can come work for us, and then you can get the money tokens in order to pay your taxes. So that's the MMT story about what drives money. Money has value because you use it to pay taxes. And the reason why there is money is because governments are using it to pull labor out of the private sector, or out of the the people, something like that. So there's an MMTer by the name of Pavlina Cherneva who says that the original sin of money is unemployment, because the government imposes this tax which causes people to need the money, so they have to go out and get jobs to earn the money. And maybe it's government jobs or working for other people who ultimately got their money from the government or something like this. But this is kind of like the basis of what money is according to MMT. I do not subscribe to that. I think it's true that you could do this, and there have been times and places in history where this has been done, where a government goes into somewhere, especially in kind of colonial times, that kind of thing, where they say, okay, now we're imposing this tax, and you can get the money to pay the tax from us by working for us, that kind of thing. That's not like a wrong story. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for a government to do, but it's not fundamental to the nature of money, I would say. So that's kind of one of my biggest gripes with MMT. And that's related to the basic income thing, because if you're an MMTer and you think, money is all based on labor and, its value comes from labor, and you're giving people money that's independent of labor, how do you square that? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, money's value fundamentally comes from labor. How can you have money that's not labor based, right? So it's like a contradiction for MMT people. So you generally don't see much basic income support from the MMT camp.
Well, they have the jobs program thing, so and
right. That's labor based.
Yeah, giving people, universal basic income kind of interferes with their central animating program. So
sure,
which is, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't call myself an MMTer, because I'm definitely not sold on the jobs guarantee program. Yeah, and it seems like that's the big policy difference that I have with him. But I have talked to Warren Mosler, and I did.
Yeah.
I mean, I asked him specifically about the jobs program because that's what I was curious about, and his answers were not great. I love Warren Mosler to death. I mean, he's a brilliant, brilliant man. But I just obviously sometimes, well, obviously the economy is beyond us all. So we're all kind of guessing on what exactly is going to happen if we do make any kind of changes. It's kind of a trial and error thing. So
yeah, but your issue with Adam, I think, is almost like the inverse of Alex's, because you agree with the descriptive story. You just don't agree with the prescriptions that they lay out.
Exactly.
So I'm assuming like you agree with MMT's perspective of money and taxing, and that's why money exists.
Sure.
That Alex doesn't agree with.
Well, I disagree with the part that it's fine for governments to do that. Obviously, it's
right. But I'm saying, I thought you thought that is why it exists, though.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess the question would be,
I do agree with the money story. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess the question that I have for Alex is, so if the MMT money story is wrong, what is the correct story?
That was my question. Yeah. Something had to do with consumer monetary theory, right? That's your thing?
Well, consumer monetary theory is just the label I gave to how I think about the economy. So it's not really like, there's no like school of thought that I've kind of like found. It's more like I've created this label so that people don't lump me in somewhere else, right? But yeah, and I just want to say I like Warren Mosler too. I think he's a really interesting fellow, and he blocked me on Twitter, which makes me very sad.
No.
So I hope he's watching this and he unblocks me.
Hold on, why would he do that?
I don't know.
What did you do, Alex?
Did you have an interaction?
Well, I had UBI at Alex Howlett UBI in my Twitter handle. I don't know. I think he was just blocking people who he thought weren't thinking about things deeply, and he kind of lumped me in. I think it was a mistake on his part. So Warren, if you're watching this, I'm not one of those people. So just keep that in mind.
Mistake, Warren.
Well, we'll I mean, yeah, we'll figure that out, right? I mean, it seems like you understand it pretty. I mean, you disagree with the MMT money story, but you explained it. It seemed aptly. It seemed like you.
Oh, thank you.
It.
That's what I'm trying. That's what I'm going for. I want to be able to accurately represent people who I disagree with and perspectives that I disagree with. Yeah.
What do you disagree with on that money story?
So I've been reading a lot of Charles Kindleberger lately because I'm kind of associated with Perry Mehrling's money view. He's a monetary economist, and he wrote a book about Charles Kindleberger. Something Kindleberger says is governments propose and markets dispose. So I would say that the market ultimately chooses what it's going to use as its pricing and payment standard. Now, that might not be in conflict with MMT, depending on how you.
Can't the government say, "I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse"? I mean, if it seems like that's what the MMT position is.
Yeah, the government can say, "I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse." How strongly can they enforce that? I don't
that's
know.
the whole idea.
If the
about
dollar
taxes.
went into hyperinflation, would we still be pricing things in dollars and using dollars as our medium of exchange? I don't think so. The government might say it.
If the dollar went into hyperinflation, though, you got to admit it would be a completely different world, because the reason why the dollar is the reserve currency, and tell me if you disagree with this, is because people want a safe and stable medium of exchange. So they look out across the world and they say, what is the best of breed in currencies, and they use that currency. So if the euro was a safer investment, then they would be using the euro. So
right, but I get the point would be if, like, yes, the government can impose things, by force, obviously, because it's the government. But at the end of the day, there's a breaking point. If inflation reaches a certain point, it doesn't matter how much force the government is enacting, the market still has the end word.
Well, if the US dollar, though, hit hyperinflation, what do you think would happen to the other currencies? I agree that if the euro wasn't in hyperinflation,
but that's not relevant to the specific point, though, about the market deciding at the end of the day, or the government deciding.
Well, he did say that if the U.S. dollar hit hyperinflation, that the market wouldn't choose the U.S. dollar, which I agree with. I'm just saying that if the dollar hit hyperinflation, all the other currencies would probably be in hyperinflation too, just because of the state of the world.
Well, yeah, but that's not.
So I think it's true right now internationally that all the other currencies are kind of tied to the dollar, even if they're not officially pegged. You've got, interest rates moving in the same direction. Exchange rates are not perfectly stable, but reasonably stable. The dollar is kind of the top of the international currency hierarchy. And that's true. I think part of the process of reaching a point where the dollar could be in hyperinflation is that you'd start to see some disconnection. You'd start to see some other currencies become less and less connected to the dollar. Like, that would be part of the process of getting into hyperinflation. And this is it's not like, oh, we hit hyperinflation and then this happens. It's right. It's like a process, right? Mm-hmm. Hyperinflation kind of corresponds with, the market transacting in other currencies, and it's a gradual.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So before we interrupted you, what was the theory of money that you were laying out?
Yeah. So how I define money, let's start with my definition of money. So I would say that money is the economy's pricing and payment standard. So you have this unit of account that you set prices in, and then you have these instruments, these tokens that you use to make payments with, and they're denominated in the unit of account. So it's the pricing standard and the payment standard. And it's not just about the security and the stability. Like, the security and stability are very important, but you could have two perfectly stable currencies, perfectly secure currencies, like, say, the dollar and the euro, for example. They're both pretty well managed right now. And the international economy chooses one of them as the international funding currency and the international reserve currency. And a big part of it has to do with this kind of network effect. You want to use the money that everyone else you're trading with is using, and that makes things more efficient. There's an analogy also that Kindleberger makes, but that I've also been making for years, is the analogy between currency and language, right? You want to speak English because other people are speaking English. You want to use the dollar because other people are using the dollar. Now, if, the dollar started not to be managed very well, people would eventually switch, but there's like a little bit of a barrier there. Like, it would have to be, you can't just be like slightly worse. The dollar can't be managed slightly worse and then everyone would leave, because everyone's already there. It's like, what gets everyone to leave Facebook and move to another social media platform, right? It has to be, there's a lot of inertia there. People kind of stay there, and gradually over time, I guess people are leaving Facebook. But you'd have to imagine something similar with the dollar, and keep in mind that the dollar wasn't always the world reserve currency. It used to be sterling. It used to be the British pound sterling, and we were on a gold standard back then internationally, but really it was a sterling standard, right? A lot of the other countries that were nominally on a gold standard, they were holding reserves in London, bills of exchange drawn on London, so they were holding these pound sterling reserve instruments, and they were convertible to gold, but they didn't need to convert them to gold most of the time. So the gold standard was really hierarchical too, with kind of sterling at the top, and sterling was pegged to gold, but they would suspend convertibility during times of war, that kind of thing as well. So it's not unheard of that you could switch to another currency, but it's not about like how big the military of the government is necessarily, although that can be a factor in kind of what's establishing it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the network effect is one thing, definitely, but some sort of hyperinflation would obviously destroy that network effect immediately. It would be the equivalent of, everyone uses Twitter because there's a network effect for Twitter. But if Twitter's servers go down, then all of a sudden, no one's using. They're moving to a new platform, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Hyperinflation wouldn't be an instantaneous thing, to be clear. But yeah, if where you ultimately get to is hyperinflation, then by the time you get there, everyone will have left.
Right.
And that's part of what hyperinflation looks like. Yeah.
So are you saying that the MMT model, basically they just say the government has all the power, it's all kind of like a top-down approach, and you're saying, well, the non-government entity has to agree and accept this, and that MMT isn't taking that into consideration?
Well, I think there is a valid story about governments going in and imposing, tax liabilities and issuing currency that can be spent to meet those tax liabilities. But it's not the only story about how to manage money or how to ensure that money has a stable value or something like that. It's one way you could do it, and it has been done in times and places. Ultimately, what the market is looking for is it's looking for a stable standard of value to standardize on, and a stable medium of exchange. So I would say that governments are in the best position to provide that. So the United States can manage the dollar really well and hope that the market uses it. They can use other tools, like legal tender stuff, and taxes can be part of it too. But taxes are just like, in order to make a payment to the United States, you have to have dollars, right? So the United States is one kind of user of dollars, in the sense that if you want to pay them, you have to pay in dollars. There are other people who are users of dollars too. The government is just a big one, right? So it's I wouldn't say that the MMT story is wrong. I would just say that it's not a story about the fundamental nature of money.
So,
okay.
Sitch, you want to give questions?
Well, I'm an economic layman. I don't know. I have no formal education in any of this. So, like, how does that really affect anything, I guess, like this kind of the theory?
The theory of
affect
what?
Policy and everything going forward.
In terms of what we should do with monetary policy and stuff like that? Yeah, well, I like to think, so another difference between me and MMT is MMT likes to think about the central bank and the Treasury as just kind of two arms of the government, and they're both the government to the extent that they might even consolidate the balance sheets and net out, anything that's owed between the Treasury and the central bank and that kind of thing. I think that's not a wrong thing to do, but it does leave something out, which is that the central bank has the power to force the government to default. The government can run out of money if the central bank stops buying government debt, and the market doesn't want to buy government debt either. And that's part of the central bank's mandate, right? Is to maintain price stability, and maybe that means they allow the prices of government debt to go down if that's what's necessary to maintain.
Why would the private sector not want to buy government debt? Why would they not want to buy treasuries?
It's not about wanting to buy or not wanting to buy, at least not marginally. It's about what's the price going to be.
You said they were going to be in trouble if the private sector didn't want to buy government treasuries.
If the price at which they want to buy it is low enough,
they were selling treasuries for zero interest rates, and people were still buying them. That's the
zero interest rates is a high price, right? The interest rate is inverse of the price, right? So a lower price of government debt would be a very high interest rate. right? Because
Right.
you're selling, let's say you're selling treasury bills at a discount. If you're selling it at a 50% discount, that's a really high interest rate.
So if I'm buying a savings instrument that pays 50% interest, that's a bad deal. I mean, what exactly are you
Well,
saying?
No,
for
it's good.
the
It's a good deal for you. The question is,
Right.
what would have to be happening in the market such that people aren't going to buy unless you offer that high
Right,
interest?
but they were selling treasuries to people for
Sure.
zero interest. So people were saying,
Yeah.
I will buy this savings instrument and make no money on it just because I want to be sure that my assets are safe and secure. So they're
So you're
buying them
asking what were
obviously
the
not for the interest rate. They're buying
right.
them to own a secure asset.
So you're asking what were the conditions that made that possible, kind of, and what would
Well,
have to
yeah,
change?
because you're saying
Yeah.
that the free market, there's a time that may come that the free market may say, you know, I don't want to buy these treasuries. And I'm asking you, well, if they're willing to buy the treasuries and literally get zero interest on the treasuries, but they still want them, what's happening there? Why is that happening?
Yeah. Well, obviously they're not buying treasuries at zero interest now.
No,
The yield are
because the
positive.
Federal Reserve raised the interest rates, but they control
Right.
that by fiat, obviously. So
Well,
why
sort
why
of. The
can they?
Federal
Why,
Reserve does
okay,
not control interest rates by fiat. They control interest rates by participating in the market. They're
yes.
deciding not to buy as many treasuries as they were buying before, and that drives down the price in the market.
Right, but they could decide to buy more and drive the price up. So they are effectively
Well,
controlling it because they have an infinite
sure.
supply of treasuries they can print.
Well, sometimes they can decide it. Well, we have to think about what constraints are the central bank
Well, just
operating under.
before we go
Yeah.
on this, I just
Yeah.
what's going on, because it is an interesting question. I hear a
I'm
lot of
trying to
people.
answer your question.
Oh, go ahead. Go answer.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would prevent the central bank from just buying up all the government debt
Well, that's not the
without
question.
limit? Oh, that's not the question. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the question was why. A lot of people say that, you know, there could come a time when the private sector decides, I don't want to buy treasuries anymore. You've made that argument there, and I'm asking, well, what would cause that? Like, what is the technical aspects of that situation? Why are they buying treasuries now, and why would they stop?
Well, if the market is flooded with treasuries, if there's just too many,
Mm-hmm.
that's it.
Okay. So they would.
So as the market has more and more treasuries on it, that just naturally drives the price down. So if you think about a dealer in
So they're
treasuries,
buying treasuries because there's a certain amount of treasuries that they're interested in maintaining in the market. I mean, that doesn't make sense. They're literally buying treasuries because they have dollars that they want to be safe and secure. So they're buying treasuries as a safe asset. So what does that have to do with the number of treasuries? So all of a sudden I have dollars that I want to convert into treasuries, but I look around and I say, oh, there's too many treasuries out there, so I'm not gonna buy treasuries. I don't understand how that makes sense.
Well, what if you're out of dollars and the government keeps trying to issue more treasuries? You have to get dollars from somewhere to buy the treasuries.
Well,
right?
right.
Well, no, by my example, I have dollars. Like,
well, if you have the dollars, then you probably prefer to hold treasuries over cash, unless you're trying to make meet a cash commitment right now, then you'd want cash. But other than
Well,
that,
I guess
hold
maybe
treasuries.
maybe the question should be,
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it's likely that there's a scenario in the future where, no one's going to want to buy bonds anymore?
I don't think it's likely because
okay.
Yeah, and the reason it's not likely is because the central bank is operating under these constraints that prevent it from allowing that to happen, right? And the government and the central bank's constraints are kind of imposing constraints on what the Treasury can do, because if the central bank raises interest rates, that reduces the amount of money that the government can borrow, or the rate at which it can roll over its funding. And if the central bank holds fast and says we don't want any inflation, yeah.
Well, they don't. They're not raising interest. Okay. I think we fundamentally disagree on why they're raising interest rates, but we don't have to get sidetracked by that. Let's. You're also an advocate of universal basic income.
Yeah.
So, what's your argument on universal basic income?
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. What is universal basic income? How would you define it?
just everyone gets like a monthly payment, and it's universal. Everybody gets it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say that it doesn't have to be monthly. It could be continuous. It could be just, every time you click refresh on your account, the amount is up by whatever the rate is. So yeah, it's an ongoing cash flow going to every individual person kind of in the economy. And yeah, that's good. That's a good description. Sometimes people throw in things like, oh, it has to be enough to meet people's basic needs or something like that. So I just wanted to kind of get clear on that. So I am a proponent of universal basic income. I think it's useful for the government to have it as a tool for distributing money into the economy, especially as an alternative to some of the tools we're using now. So one of these tools, the big one that I like to emphasize, is that the central bank keeps interest rates low in order to stimulate the financial sector and stimulate employment. So you've got this kind of expansion of private credit that is in place to kind of keep money flowing into the economy. So there's a way in which we could think about it as the government is trying to get the private sector to print our money for us. And this causes all kinds of distortions in the financial sector and in the labor market, because now you're employing people for the purpose of reducing unemployment instead of for the product of labor, at least ultimately, when you're talking about it at a economic policy level.
What do you mean? What do you mean by the government is trying to get the private sector to print our money? So that's you said
make
that.
credit easier, credit expansion. So when the central bank is lowering interest rates or otherwise making credit easier, they're saying, hey,
right. They're incentivizing banks to make loans
and businesses to borrow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my primary question on UBI. So you agree that there's like an equilibrium in the economy between the size of the money supply and the amount of productivity in the economy, correct?
I think, yeah, money supply is a tricky term because when some people talk about it, they're talking about like the stock of money that's just kind of circulating around. Whereas, I would say that in order for the price level to be stable, there has to be a balance between the flow of spending and the flow of economic output. And you can get really tricky when you're talking about like, well, how much money is in the economy, or, which instruments are we including in the money stock, that kind of thing. I kind of stay away from that. We know how to increase the amount of spending in the economy through expansionary monetary policy. We know how to do contractionary monetary policy to go in the other direction, right? So I view basic income as an alternative to overly expansionary monetary policy.
So what can you explain how that would work technically, your program?
Oh, wait, let me clarify something before we continue. Some people in our chat were confused. When you said you click a button to refresh your UBI, I assume what you meant was that like there's be some set amount that you would get total per month, but you could get it whenever you wanted.
You get it on an ongoing basis.
Right. It's not like you can just click a button and you just get a full amount whenever you want.
Click.
Yeah, okay, so people didn't understand.
No, you refresh 10 minutes later and you have 10 minutes more of UBI.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. Anyway, I'm sorry. What'd you ask, Adam?
I was just so like money comes into the economy through spending or lending, bank lending. Obviously, right. Interest rates affect how much people want to borrow money.
Yeah.
So, but there is this agreement that goes on with productivity in government spending and in bank lending, because whenever a bank lends money, they're lending it with the assumption that you're going to pay it back, terms to pay it back with interest. So in that agreement, there is the idea that whatever the person is going to use the money for is going to increase productivity, because that money they're using to generate products and services that are more valuable than the money being loaned. So it's a safe loans are a safe bet. Banks making loans are a safe bet for increasing productivity in the economy. Spending also increases productivity just by buying the productivity. I mean, people will argue how effective the productivity is. But the things that the government buys are things like police, fire protection, judges, all of these things. I would argue, judges create secure property rights, police create safety and security, which obviously increases economic output. It's much safer if you're running a factory than to have a safe and secure environment, that kind of thing. So I think that obviously increases productivity. My problem with UBI is if you're just giving money to people without any sort of implicit contract that they will use that money to increase productivity, then you're just basically expanding the money supply and potentially causing inflation. And inflation is always, that's the problem. So
yeah, so any money source, if it's too much money, is going to cause inflation, regardless of what mechanism you're using to distribute that money. So you have to get it right.
Right.
If you set the basic income too high, that's inflation. But there's a level of spending that the economy can productively respond to, and you want to allow the economy to productively respond at the level that it is capable. And the question is, what mechanisms are you trying to use to activate that production?
Yeah, that's it.
Now, you've made a few comments here that maybe you kind of assumed I agreed that bank loans depend on productivity. I would say a couple things about this.
Okay.
One is that most lending in the economy does not happen through traditional commercial banks, or what you and I would think of as a bank. It happens in capital markets. Right. And there's a lot of bonds and other issuances and stuff like that. And you have, money markets, funding capital markets, and, it can get complicated, but we can simplify this down and imagine that
in those markets, though, in the capital markets, like stocks and bonds and stuff like that, you're dealing with money that is already in the economy. When it's a bank that's chartered by the central bank, you're literally just creating money out of thin air. But if I'm a company and I want to raise money to develop some new product and service, I could go out to the private sector and say, buy my stock. Those dollars, though, that they're giving me to buy the stock aren't freshly created dollars. They're dollars that are already circulating in the economy, already in somebody's bank account, already in somebody's 401k. But when you go to a bank and you get a bank loan, the mortgage on your home, for instance, that's brand new money they just created. So it's a completely different scenario.
So I'm going to disagree with you and say it's not a completely different scenario.
Okay.
That in both cases, you have lending institutions that are expanding their balance sheets on both sides. They're expanding their assets and they're expanding their liabilities.
Yeah, but one institution has an infinite balance sheet because they literally print the money.
Well, so that raises an interesting question. What are the constraints on printing money, right?
Productivity.
Well,
I thought we agreed on that point.
That's the real constraint in terms of like how much spending can the economy handle.
We do agree on that point, correct? It is productivity.
In real terms,
yes,
right? In balance sheet terms, what are the constraints? And well, if the central bank wants to keep the price level stable, then it wants balance sheets terms to be the same as real terms, because it wants the real prices to be the same as the nominal prices on kind of an ongoing basis.
Right, because they want to achieve price stability. Exactly right.
So there's no infinite expansion of real purchasing power because there's no infinite expansion of real economic productivity.
Well, this is, and we're doing great here. This is why I'm specifically bringing up the idea of bank lending, because in the bank lending model, there's this implicit deal here that if I loan you money, you're going to pay that money back with interest. Therefore, whatever endeavor you have, it can be a decentralized system. I don't have to know what kind of business you're doing. It's a restaurant. It's a auto repair place. You're building a time machine. I don't know what it is that you're doing, but that whatever endeavor you're going to engage in will be productive enough to actually produce more money, more productivity, more value than the money that you're actually borrowing. So when you pay that money back to the bank and the bank deletes that money from existence, the value left in the economy is more than what you started with. With UBI, you don't necessarily have that situation because you're giving somebody money, and whether or not they use it to be productive, who knows?
Yeah, so you're kind of imagining that it's not possible to have unproductive lending because banks wouldn't do it if it was
No, it
unproductive.
is very productive. I will go out on a limb and say the guy working on the time machine is not going to pay the loan back. He's definitely not going to produce a time machine, and that
So
money
you wouldn't
will
make
be
that
lost.
loan, right? Yeah,
Well, I mean, I would probably make that loan. Who knows? Maybe it's possible.
because you think the time machine is going
Well,
to
but this is
succeed.
like this is the whole idea behind bank lending. The banks are the ones that we basically outsource this gatekeeping idea on. They're the the bean counters that look at the proposals and decide whether or not this is going to be productive or not. With UBI, you don't have any kind of gatekeeping on that. And I understand a lot of people. We just talked to Scott. Scott will say, "Well, we're studying this, and it looks
not.
like." Well, no, he actually
Anyway, go
listed.
ahead.
Well, he
Yeah.
actually listed a few studies that
Yeah,
evidently
people like to
show that
list
people
studies.
are more productive. Well, evidently you disagree with those studies.
I don't agree with those studies. Yeah.
Okay, so but those
I don't
studies.
think UBI depends on how productive people are when you give it to them or anything like
Okay,
that.
What does it depend on?
Well, it depends on the level of spending the economy can handle, and
But
if
what
the
you're saying?
if we're
that
pushing money
depends
to
on
people through make work,
productivity.
right now we're pushing money to people through make work, so we're paying them to spend their time in unproductive ways.
No, I
UBI is an
agree.
alternative to that.
Right.
Yes, but look,
Okay.
the spending
yeah.
the spending limit is linked to productivity, is it not?
Yes,
Okay, we agree
Yeah.
there.
but that doesn't mean the people you give the money to have to be the ones who are being productive.
Right, I agree. Like you could
Okay.
if you give money out to 50 people and 48 of them are lazy pieces of shit that are just going to smoke their UBI payments up into oblivion, and two
Yeah.
of them are going to produce the next Blair Witch Project and make 50 gazillion dollars in
The next
merchandising.
Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, whatever, some
You've
independent
dated
film.
yourself, Adam.
Okay, what's the independent film that is like done with a camcorder in the modern
It's
age?
Blair Witch Project.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm the
There's
same age
never-
as you, probably. Yeah.
So anyway, they're going to take a obscenely low amount of money and turn it into some amazing amount of productivity. They're going to look.
Sure.
You don't like Blair Witch? They're going to build the time machine.
I thought
okay?
it was annoying that they kept coming to the same stream and they didn't think to just follow the flow of the water in the stream to a river. Right?
I don't know how. I don't know how that
they
movie
could have
was.
had, maybe it goes underwater or something like that. But
Yeah,
they
if you
didn't
get lost,
do
follow
that.
the river to try to find
Exactly.
I don't
bigger
know how
body
that
of
City
movie.
eventually.
I don't know how
Yeah.
that movie. But the example is the two people are going to be so productive that they're going to make up for the 48 people that are completely unproductive. I am willing to entertain that argument. I live in a world where we need evidence, and if I want to go up to Capitol Hill and make my argument to Congress about how we need UBI, they're going to ask me for some evidence. And I can't just go, "Oh, I feel in my heart of hearts that people will be productive."
No, you can't say that. Yeah. And how productive people are going to be has nothing to do with whether basic income is a useful tool for distributing money. It has to do with, well, if people are less productive when you hand them money and let them do whatever they want, then maybe that lowers the level of basic income that the economy can sustain.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but we don't have to go to Congress and say the economy can sustain X amount of basic income. We just have to go to Congress and say, hey, we want this as part of our policy tool, and we don't want to overstimulate the financial sector. And when we find ourselves starting to do that, we can do basic income instead, and we can find out. It's we have to feel out what the economy can handle, and that amount might change over time too as we get more productive or less productive.
So it sounded like you were saying that there's some trade-off that UBI is taking away from financial sector stimulation or something. What's
That's
that?
right.
I mean, I in all honesty, I'm
Well-
just like trying to understand your position. So
Yeah, so right now we use monetary policy to stimulate the financial sector. We lower interest rates, make credit conditions easier, to get businesses to borrow, to make it more profitable for businesses to keep going and to hire more people. And so it's kind of this, we stimulate the financial sector to stimulate the labor market. So we're kind of creating jobs indirectly through the market. So this is what I mean about make
we're
work.
creating productivity, though. That's the whole purpose of
No, not if you're doing it for the purpose of supporting demand. right? If you're allowing the market to allocate resources, then it will allocate based on what's productive. But if you are saying, hey, we need more demand in the economy, we need more spending and that kind of thing, let's stimulate the financial sector beyond where it would ordinarily go. Well, now you're not lending productively anymore. You're stimulating lending above and beyond what's productive, and you're stimulating employment above and beyond what's productive. And that's the status quo. That's what we do today.
Well, but if in the actual, if you're putting those resources to work, producing more goods and services, they're productive by just definition.
Hey, if you are making credit conditions easier because you want the economy to be more productive, because there are resources that you want to be put to work productively that aren't being put to work, and you think the economy can have more output, that's fine. But that's not why we do it. We do it to stimulate demand. We do it to create jobs.
Well, we do it for both reasons. That's the thing.
Well, there's always going to be both effects, right? The question is, why are you doing it? If you are doing it beyond if we were living in a world where we wanted the economy to be productive and we were allowing the financial sector to invest in productive capital investments, and that was the only thing we cared about, and we didn't care about unemployment or anything like that, then then it would be fine. Then everything would be efficient, right? And labor allocation would be efficient. But if we were doing that, and you're doing that in a world without basic income, then it doesn't work, right? It's only possible to do that if you don't force people's source of money to be tied to jobs. If you force people's money to be tied to jobs, then it forces you to create jobs as an excuse to hand people money. So we're handing people money right now. We're just doing it in this really inefficient, unequally distributed, unstable way by stimulating the financial sector and distorting the labor market's allocation of labor.
So you're saying that we should just hand people the money. So here's the Here is the issue that I see, and a lot of UBI advocates do this.
Sure.
And so if you're just like, you have to think of the economy as there's a bunch of people, right? And those people are going to produce goods and services. And those people are also going to buy goods and services. So you have goods and services that people are both the producers of and the consumers of. What happens if you just give everybody money? Then all of a sudden nobody wants to be a producer. They just want to be a consumer. Like, you're literally paying people not to produce anything. So how do you have this magic world where people can just be consumers and they don't have to be producers, because then you don't have anything to consume?
You don't. You can't do that. That's
okay.
And if you set the basic income too high, then that's what you get, right? There's, but an individual person, we don't need each individual person to be a producer. That's fine. So we do need each individual person to be a consumer if we want them to be okay.
So
right,
obviously,
you got to get the incentives in the economy right, such that the amount of stuff we need and want is actually being produced.
So, but going down this road assumes that there's a level of production that requires no labor. And that just is not true.
No, it just doesn't assume that we have to have labor from everyone. The labor does not have to be evenly distributed, right?
Right.
Some people could be doing more work than others.
But if you have UBI, you're literally giving everybody the opportunity not to produce anything. You're going to get people who take that.
You're changing the incentives, right? So you are lowering, for most people, it would lower the incentive to work. But you wouldn't want to set it so high that it's actually bad for labor. That would actually be inflationary, right? Because you'd lower production and be giving people more money.
So it has to be low enough that people still have to work then.
No, not each individual, not that people still have to work, but that the incentives are such that enough people want to do the work of the society, right? Because just because you're getting money, not everyone is just going to not work, right? But we don't know people's psychology. We don't know, what level of basic income is going to correspond with the optimal labor allocation, with the right amount of work being done in the economy. Yeah.
No, it's kind of, you got to go trial and error. Sitch,
exactly. Yeah.
I think I've got all my questions answered. How about you? Are there any super chats?
Yeah, there's some. Zombie Squad says, wouldn't the type of government, whether it's federal versus unitary state, impact how UBI is distributed? I guess.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I don't know what that means either.
Well, you can't do UBI on a state level because like I
Oh, I see what
said,
you're saying.
the states don't have an infinite balance sheet like the federal government does.
Well,
Well,
you
the
could
federal
do
government
it.
doesn't have an infinite balance sheet either. That's right. We established that it's constrained by real
Well,
resources.
they said unitary state, which is
So
a
I think what
sovereign
they're talking
state
about
governed
is
as a
at the
single
level of the whole
entity.
country or at the level of an individual state within the country. Is that what they're talking
No,
about?
they mean something different, which I
I don't
don't know
know.
why they brought it up. They mean a sovereign state governed as a single entity in which the central government is the supreme authority. I mean, obviously that would change things, but I don't think anyone's advocating for that, at
Yeah.
least in America. So,
I mean, I think you would generally want to do it kind of, since I view UBI as an alternative to expansionary monetary policy,
right.
I would want to do it kind of at whatever level of kind of area is covered by the central bank, or like the monetary zone or something like that. Yeah.
How do you feel about getting rid of income tax entirely?
Well, this is not really related to UBI. I mean, I think UBI doesn't depend on any of these, changing anything else
You
with
could
what we're
definitely
doing with
sell it to
fiscal
right wingers
policy.
easier if you paired them up.
I know. I'm down.
I don't. Well, I'm not pairing up UBI. I personally, I'm in
Right.
favor of getting rid of income tax.
Oh,
Personally, I am.
nice.
Me
Okay.
too.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Well, but UBI does not depend on that. If you
Right.
got rid of income tax, that might change the level of UBI your economy can sustain. It might increase it, depending on, or it might decrease it depending on various factors. But there are lots of fiscal adjustments that you could make, and that would change kind of a lot of parameters that would affect the level of UBI that is optimal for the economy. What you don't want is a financial sector that's kind of booming and busting all the time, because that's a side effect of the way we're pushing money to people right now.
If we got rid of income tax, how would we like deal with that? What would be the replacement mechanism?
First of all, just on the boom,
or like what, how
on the boom and bust thing.
Yeah,
I disagree on the boom and bust thing. That's all I need to say.
Okay. No, but I mean, what would be, so if we got rid of income tax, would we have other taxes to replace that? Like, how would it work?
Well, on its own, you get rid of the income tax, and if you just do that, that increases the deficit, right, on its own.
Right.
The Fed itself smooths out the boom and bust cycle. The boom and bust cycle is caused by irrational exuberance and irrational fear.
I very much
that's not going to go away.
That.
Well, I know. I figured we disagreed, but that's why I didn't want you to say.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people on the left and right both talk about, they think the Fed is actually causing the boom and bust cycle when the Fed is actually muting the boom and bust cycle. The boom and bust cycle was much worse before the Fed.
I think the Fed is doing great. They're doing, the right stuff. I think there's limits to what they can achieve.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I don't think the Fed is causing the boom and bust cycle, but I also don't think irrational exuberance or irrational pessimism are causing the boom and bust cycle. I think there is some of that. There's always some of that.
How? Because
what causes it?
What causes it is people.
Well, no, I'm asking Alex. What is his version of what causes it?
Well, you could have perfectly rational actors in the economy, doing everything as rational as possible, and you'd still have a boom and bust, is my argument. And then what's causing it is that the central bank needs to keep a stable price level. They need to prevent deflation. So what they do is they make credit conditions more expansionary, and they make it rational for people to lend and borrow more. And this creates the instability, right? So if you had a basic income, you wouldn't need the central bank to be propping up the price level through the financial sector.
But it's still irrational.
Wait. As someone who's an idiot, because I'm an idiot, walk me through that, because I don't follow exactly the mechanism.
So we might think that a boom happens because of irrational exuberance. But let's imagine that the irrational exuberance, for whatever reason isn't happening, and there isn't a boom happening. Then what happens? Well, then you have deflation. So the central bank has to make it rational for people for credit to expand in this way that is boomy and can be unstable in order to prevent deflation. Like that's just what they have to do. If you don't have something like a basic income.
That part is true.
Yeah. So you might say that the central bank is acting irrationally, but they're following their mandate to maintain a stable price level and prevent deflation.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true. So they're basically loaning out money, and the interest rates affect whether or not people take out loans. And people take out loans because they are going to start a business for, build some new product or service, right? So when I'm saying irrational exuberance, I'm saying that people perceive there being far more opportunities than there actually are. So obviously,
so you're saying so you're saying they lower the interest rate that causes
people to seek out opportunities to make money.
Spend too much. It causes the
to
boom. Is that what you're
borrow
saying?
money and spend. Yes.
Yes.
Some of those opportunities, they turn out to be insane.
Bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Like the .com bust is the perfect example of this, right? Like they're starting companies that don't even have any source of income.
And you're saying all the screw ups from the excitement is what causes the
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. The housing crash is the same exact thing. You got, The Big Short. You got a stripper in Vegas that owns 14 homes, right?
Okay. And Alex is saying that there's a different mechanism at play here, right?
I'm not saying, well, sort of. I'm saying that if people weren't irrationally exuberant, then the Fed would have to stimulate things until people were behaving in an irrationally exuberant way.
So you're saying, okay. So you're saying so if they lowered interest rates and people started spending more and taking out more loans, even if every single person made the correct business decision, they still need increased growth. So they still would have to keep trying to poke the economy until essentially people
more and more. Yeah,
I see what you're saying.
Until
credit expands to prevent deflation.
Right.
Yeah. It's automatically going to be a house of cards. If people are just irrationally exuberant on their own, then the Fed doesn't have to stimulate as much.
This is
more convenient.
This is the thing, and this is why a lot of people argue about this, because a lot of people would say the counter argument to that is when they realize that they're getting towards that irrational exuberance mania, that's when they raise interest rates and they kind of take a foot off the gas and tap the brake a little bit and try and slow
but you're
down.
still creating that, the cycle, the up down cycle. So wait, but how would UBI stop that, I guess?
Well, UBI means that you can ensure that there's enough money flowing in the economy without having to overstimulate the financial sector.
Yeah, but
it's not productive money though.
Wait.
It's not productive money anyway, Adam.
It literally is.
Wait.
Okay.
If they still need to always poke the economy to create growth, I guess I'm not following how UBI would...
Not poking the economy to create growth. It's poking the economy to keep the price level stable. To keep the monetary standard stable.
You're both. It is both, to be honest with you, because
it's not that it doesn't cause growth, right?
Well, the growth is what keeps the price level stable. Like the way that you can continue to put money in and the price doesn't go up or down is because you've got the production level rising along with the size of the money supply. That's why you get price stability. If you have the productivity going up and the amount of money going down, you get the deflation problem.
So I just want to say that there's a lot of disagreement among monetary economists and macroeconomists, and clearly there's disagreement between me and Adam here. I don't think adding more money to the economy necessarily depends on growth, because I think people accumulate money, right? There's places in the economy where the money flows to and it doesn't flow back out from.
Right.
And there are some issues there, like, well, how do you prevent people's hoards of money from getting too big? And sometimes it's not in the form of cash or even bank deposits. Sometimes it's in the form of treasuries.
Yeah, they turn it into treasuries for that reason.
They turn it into treasuries. And the cash itself is cycling, right? But so you can look at it in kind of as fine detail as you want. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that the Fed is stimulating the private financial sector to pump money into the economy. Like, the money is being printed in the private sector through banks and other entities that do banking. Perry Merling, this economist who I mentioned before, who I really like, he likes to say that everyone is a bank. So this money creation thing is not like a special privilege of banks or something. It's true that banks have specialized in doing this kind of business so that their liabilities end up getting used as money by other people. But when you expand your balance sheet on both sides, when you borrow in order to buy some kind of asset, you're issuing something that has a monetary value. People might not be using it to make payments, but it's an asset on their balance sheet. Everybody can print money.
Mhm.
If your counterparty is willing to accept your liabilities, and if we have a bank, we're accepting the liabilities of a bank as a bank deposit, and banks specialize in doing this. But there are other entities that we don't call banks that are doing this too in the financial sector, in the capital markets.
Well,
businesses, right, are issuing bonds.
If you frame this as anyone can write an IOU, people instantly understand it, which is true.
Anybody can write an IOU, and that's what banks are doing. That's what they're doing when they're creating money out of thin air. They're just writing IOUs.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So anymore?
Okay. I'm not sure I follow, but it's fine.
Sitch, how do you not know this stuff inside and out already?
Because I watch movies.
I don't
know these things.
Look, I know all the CRT stuff just because you talk about it. So it's like,
what's the CRT stuff? Critical race theory.
You pick it up along the way, exactly.
No, but like, okay, so
like cathode ray tubes. What does that have to do?
Yeah.
Well, I'm just.
Okay. So going back, we have they raise interest rates to get more spending. You said
they lower interest rates.
Lower interest rates to get people more spending into taking out loans, right? And so then
to get businesses to borrow more and hire.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's to lower risk for economic expansion.
Right. Yeah. I understand that. So then that creates growth, right? But so then the growth affects the price of everything in terms of making it less expensive or more expensive.
That's not how I would describe it.
Well, if you're
then I guess wait. So then because you're saying that the Fed has to keep adjusting things for price stability. What is the mechanism?
It's from the demand side.
Okay.
They're putting more money in people's pockets so they can spend the money. And if they didn't do that, then you'd have deflation.
But if you increase demand and you don't increase productivity, what is going to happen?
You just want to keep demand the same. You want to prop it up. Right.
Okay. So
you have to keep expanding credit in order to keep demand the same.
So if the economy is doing very well, So if the economy is doing very well, why would that necessitate all of a sudden that there would be a change in demand or price stability?
It wouldn't. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what you mean, and it also what does it mean for the economy to be doing very well?
Well, no, I thought
question. Yeah,
because I thought the contention was that with the whole boom bust thing, is Adam is saying this is just a natural thing that is basically cannot get rid of, and you're saying, well, no, it's not. It can be gotten rid of, and that UBI would solve it. I guess I still can't track that mechanism, how UBI solves the boom bust cycle.
Because I'm telling a story about how the boom bust cycle is being caused by the need for a stable price level. And by using the private financial sector as the channel through which the stable price level is maintained.
And I'm saying the boom and bust cycle is caused by the perception of opportunities that turn out to not be opportunities.
Right, but I think I agree somewhat more with Alex's description. I'm just not sure I understand how. I don't know enough about economics to understand exactly how this all works out.
Yeah, that's fine.
In my mind. So.
It's not, it's not something that a lot of people think about. I guess, So how should I describe, or what should I say?
Okay,
I don't know.
Well, okay, so the price stability is the key. That's what the Fed's trying to do. Trying to keep prices stable, right? That's the goal.
Yeah.
And
gas needs to be the same.
Interest rates are low. So what do they have to do to keep prices stable when interest rates are low after an extended period of time?
So if what they're trying to do is prevent deflation and interest rates are already at zero or something like that, then they have to find another way to expand credit in the economy. They have to find another way to get businesses to borrow more and hire more people, make it more profitable for businesses to do these things. So that's when, after 2008, we started to see what was then called unconventional monetary policy, quantitative easing and stuff like that, which has become more kind of conventional in the decade since then. But there has to be some way of ensuring that there's enough demand that the flow of money is going to be meeting the flow of economic output, is going to be matching the flow of economic output.
I see. And you're saying, so if we had UBI, it would basically fill that demand, or it would allow that demand void to be filled?
Yeah, exactly. It would allow it to be filled without having to do this stimulus of the financial sector, and
Hmm.
by extension, creating jobs that are unproductive, that exist for the purpose of boosting demand.
Do you think the
Interesting.
economy should be growing, Alex?
I love economic growth. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm happy for
Okay.
the economy to be growing.
Okay.
Um, I don't think
Wouldn't
there's
it?
anyone who
Mhm.
doesn't think it's good for the economy to be growing.
Well, the
Um,
weird environmentalists who think we're all going
So
to
the
die in like
environmentalists,
10 years.
when they talk about economic growth, they're not talking about the things that economists are talking about when they talk about
Right.
economic growth. Environmentalists are talking about conserving resources and not like burning through all of our stuff. You can have economic growth that is not necessarily using more resources than you were before, if you're
Right.
just increasing efficiency, that kind of thing. So maybe, in the name of conservation, we might want to conserve resources to the extent that it actually would constrain actual like levels of economic output. But I don't think we're there.
Right.
But it's important that we kind of tease apart what these different issues are. One is, are we getting the most we can out of our economy? And that means using our resources as efficiently as possible, including labor, including people's time, even when they're not working, right? Like if people are spending their time outside of a job, they're doing something with their time,
Mhm.
right? And it might be really
Hypothetically.
unproductive. Well, it might be they might be spending it really unproductively. They might be doing things productively.
Who's he
There's a
talking to,
range, right?
Not me.
It, yeah, and it might be you guys. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, if you indiscriminately try to employ everyone, then you're pulling everyone away from what they would otherwise be doing, regardless of how productive
Hmm.
it might be.
Right.
And that's one of the things that's scary to me about the job guarantee, for example.
Hmm.
Well, I
So
agree with you on that. So there's a point of
what
agreement.
Okay.
if UBI kind of affected or changed or was, the demand was fixing the demand problem for the boom bust cycle, wouldn't it just shift basically that what is affecting the boom bust instead of would being the Fed monkeying with the interest rates or quantitative easing or whatever they're doing? Wouldn't it just be that
Well,
they'd have to keep changing the level of UBI to keep matching whatever the demand is?
Well, it's useful to think about like what is kind of the mechanism behind the boom bust, and
Hmm.
particularly the bust in particular. So you've got when the private financial sector expands, you've got all these kind of interlocking private debt obligations. It's like, a line of dominoes where,
Right.
if one person defaults, then that person can't make their
Right.
payment to the next person, and you get this cascading credit collapse. What you're doing when the government is just paying the money directly into the economy, if the government is printing our money instead of the government asking the private financial sector to print our money, you're replacing all this interconnected brittle web of private debt with one single borrower, the government. That's the government. That's the national debt, right? So it's a much more stable situation, and it's also much more efficient because when you're stimulating the private financial sector for the benefit of boosting demand, only a certain amount, only a tiny amount of that kind of leaks out into jobs and wages and stuff, right? So you're really getting much more credit expansion for the actual thing that you want. Whereas if you're paying out a basic income, the amount of borrowing that the government does is just equal to the amount of spending that they do in excess of their taxation.
That money has to be paid back, though. So, I mean,
I don't know what that means.
well, when you're talking about credit expansion, you're talking about banks making loans, right?
Yeah, yeah. So if they can't pay it back, then that's a default, and
Well,
then
obviously, yeah,
yeah,
default is when they can't, but
yeah.
theoretically, they're borrowing the money with the intention of paying it back because they have
Oh,
some
sure, yeah.
productive business opportunity going.
You keep saying productive. It's more complicated than that. They're borrowing with the expectation that they're going to get paid back. And maybe in their own internal calculations, they think of the lending as productive, or maybe they're just a bank that gives you a mortgage and knows that there's a market for mortgage-backed security, so they issue the mortgage and then sell the mortgage to another financial institution that then securitizes it and sells it all onto the market, and there are people buying up this stuff, as a speculative investment, that kind of thing. And then the bank can keep generating more mortgages. It doesn't keep it on its own balance sheet, that kind of thing, right? So it's not, it's not as simple as saying, the banks lend because they think it's going to be productive. They lend because they think it's going to be profitable and they think they're going to get paid.
Well, profitable and productive are the same thing. So,
Not if you've distorted the markets.
Well, I mean, I agree that the financial assets, like we're wasting a huge amount of human power on the financial industry. So I agree that the financial
Yeah.
industry is theoretically productive, but
It's theoretically
it's
productive
not
if it's operating efficiently. It's
right.
not productive anymore if you're stimulating it for the purpose of like squeezing, like hoping that some money might leak out through jobs, which is what we're doing now.
Well, I think people can understand our position. Sitch, you want to finish up the super chats, or are there any more that
Um,
are UBI related? Alex, do you want
I
to?
mean,
Do you want to?
not like a question. Those UBI is like communism, both utopias. It looks good on paper, but in reality, it will crash and burn the same way. The problem conservatives and money distribution is where it's coming from and abuse of the system that addresses that.
Is there a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, there wasn't really a question in there, but
I mean, you can call it communism.
right.
Communism is a very labor-based thing, and I would say that both the left and the right are hung up on labor. On the left, people say that labor is being exploited and people are poor because they are workers who are, being
Profit is
oppressed,
fast.
that kind of thing. And then people on the right say that people are poor because you're not working hard enough or something like that. It's all
Hmm.
about labor and work and this work ethic kind of mentality. And I'm saying that that mentality is causing a lot of problems in terms of how we structure our economy. And if we don't think of people primarily as workers, we think of work and labor as an input to the economy, and we only use it to the extent that it's needed, then we're going to be okay.
But you're only thinking of worker. You're only thinking of people as consumers. That's my fundamental
Yeah.
difference with you. You're
Well,
saying people are only consumers, and I'm asking, well, no, people are consumers and producers, and if no one produces the stuff, there is no stuff to consume.
sure. If nobody produces the stuff, there's no stuff to consume. That's true. I'm
Okay.
not saying that people are only consumers. I'm saying that everybody is a consumer, and
And a
consumer is a
producer.
role. No, not everybody's a producer.
Okay, so you're
Uh,
saying people have the option of being a producer. They
well,
can, there are people, and
yeah,
if everyone wanted to do this because it's universal, they could choose to be consumer only. They could get a
yeah,
t-shirt that says, I only consume.
yeah. They could,
Don't
yeah,
ask
and they'd
me
have
to
the money to
produce
buy it too.
anything.
Yeah, who's producing those T-shirts?
Yeah,
Yeah, and
exactly.
I think yeah, I think what you're saying is fundamentally right, that
Okay.
being a consumer and being a producer are both roles, and you need enough people to be producers to
Right.
produce the stuff that the consumers are consuming. Otherwise, everything falls apart.
Sure.
So the
Okay.
question is, how do you
How do
get
you
those incentives at
incentivize
the
them?
right level?
Yeah,
You don't
exactly.
want to under incentivize work, and you don't want to over incentivize work either, because that's when you get into make work territory. You're employing people as an excuse to pay them. So I'm saying that basic income is a tool that we can use to get to that sweet spot where people aren't underemployed and they're not overemployed either, where people aren't working not enough and they're not working too much
Well, here
for
I
what the economy needs.
like this. The carrot stick analogy works perfectly. I
Mm-hmm.
want to get to a world where we don't have any more sticks, where the stick is just, we don't need the stick, it's all carrot, right?
Every carrot is a stick, depending on how you frame it, and vice versa.
Okay, well, let me finish and then you can elaborate on that.
Okay.
I'm just saying that in the world you've had, like, some people do not respond to carrots. They only
Sure.
respond to sticks. So those
Okay.
people you will actually have no control over ever again. So you're basically saying a carrot is a stick by another name.
Yeah.
So
I mean, obviously, psychologically, it feels different. There are different ways of structuring incentives feel like different things to different people.
sure,
But
totally.
you can say that the absence of a carrot is a form of a stick. Like logically speaking, you can kind of frame it that way.
But you understand
Right.
the point that I'm making about motivation. That
Yeah.
people, if somebody is doing something because it's something they want to do, as opposed to being something that they're forced to do or
Yeah.
have to do to make enough money so that they aren't living under a bridge somewhere, there's a certain amount of force in one situation and zero amount of force in the other situation. And I want to live in a world where we have a zero amount of force. And the sticking point for me is just this idea that we are all, whether we like it or not, producers and consumers. And I don't know that we can live in a world where we're only consumers. Obviously, we can once the robots take over, and I'm all in favor of that. And I think, if we can get to a automation economy where everyone's working 2 days a week part-time, I mean, that sounds great to me.
Well, I'll tell you that the robots can't take over if we're living in a world where we use economic policy to keep everyone employed, and that prevents the robots from taking over.
Well, this was Scott's.
That's
this
what
is
we're doing
Scott.
right now.
Why do you disagree with Scott? This is Scott's argument.
I don't disagree with Scott on everything. Just like the schools of economics mostly agree on most things. Yeah,
Okay.
Well, I don't know what he said about the robots taking over, but I would say that like if you don't have a basic income, the robots can't take over because you're keeping everyone employed, and that's the way of pushing money to people. But yeah, I mean, you can't have a world without any force. The question we need to ask is, to what extent do we need to force people to work? And then you need to set the basic income at a low enough level that people are forced to do the amount of work that the economy needs.
Right. So
and that doesn't mean each individual person is working. It means that, collectively, in aggregate, enough people are doing enough work.
Well, this is where you get the communist label, and I get it too. So it's not just on you. Obviously, they're like, "You're talking about UBI, you're a communist." It's
okay. You can use whatever labels you want. I won't be offended.
Okay, me too. So the like, people do fundamentally enjoy work. I enjoy work. I mean, a lot of people do enjoy work, but I know a lot of people do work that they don't enjoy, and I wouldn't enjoy, and probably no human being would enjoy, so that they can do other things that they enjoy. So I just, the sticking point for me is we have jobs that nobody wants to do. And obviously, if those jobs are not done, we can't all be consumers, because those jobs tend to be
advocating
like
that everyone is
worker.
only a consumer, right? I'm not right. And of course, you need people to do work that people don't want to do. So how do you get them to do it? And you got to pay them to do it. You got to do some combination of withholding, keeping the basic income low enough, and providing enough wage to get that work done.
Right. Yeah. And I'm an advocate of experimenting with it and trying to figure it out, obviously. So if the amount of employees, the cost of employees goes up at the dairy, and then all of a sudden milk prices go up, then the UBI is not necessarily buying enough to pay for the milk. So
I'm not saying that
that's the situation.
The introduction of UBI won't affect prices, but you want to do it in such a way that, milk prices going up will correspond with other prices going down somewhere else in the market basket of consumer goods, that kind of thing.
I think the practical problem, I mean, I like all this in theory. I think the practical problem in implementation would be, like, you'd want to roll this out slowly. So you'd start at like a low number and you kind of work up, and you'd have to try to keep, you'd have to try to find that, the sweet spot we're all talking about. But in our kind of like political framework, no politician, like, once UBI exists, no politician is going to want to like lower it, right? Like that's kind of the problem.
So here's a question. I mean, that's always a tricky issue, and it's a tricky issue with monetary policy too, right? So how do you make it politically independent, that kind of thing? Do you have like a separate basic income authority who can't, is more protected from kind of political influence, that kind of thing?
Right.
Maybe you have
Congress
an institution like a central bank, but for the basic income. I don't know. Like, it is all kinds of possibilities in that way, and sometimes I write about that and talk about that.
You'd have to do something like that, yeah.
I think probably, yeah. So a question I like to ask sometimes is, if you're anti-basic income, or if you're skeptical of basic income, UBI, I use these terms interchangeably, by the way. Sometimes in MMT, they use basic income to mean like something that's not universal or something like that. But I don't do that. But if you're skeptical, or you're against it, a question I can ask is, why is the optimal level of basic income for the economy zero? Right? Why isn't it negative? Why isn't it that everyone puts in $200 a month to fund the government? Right? Or why, it seems like it would be a huge coincidence for it to be exactly zero.
Right.
And then once you acknowledge that, well, wait a minute, that's very strange that we're at zero, and there are people saying it should stay at zero, without at least questioning that maybe it should be lower than zero or higher than zero. That makes you think, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to like open the conversation. I was thinking sort of almost in line with
Instead, we're
that.
doing it at the end, but yeah.
Right, exactly. I think almost in line with that is kind of like a lot of libertarians bring the argument that taxation is theft. And when you kind of go down that rabbit hole, it's, basically because no one gets to choose to live in, a society without government.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe the reverse of that should be the argument for UBI. Well, since you don't get the choice, the government pays you like that. Like that's your, like it's almost like your service fee for living in a country. It's like
Oh,
your
that's
UBI.
brilliant. That's brilliant.
Yeah. This does not, what's the word? It really doesn't resonate with me at all.
Well, it doesn't resonate with you, but you don't need to be convinced of UBI, do you? So that doesn't matter.
I don't.
Right.
Yeah. I think, you can call taxation theft. That's another label. It doesn't matter whether it's theft or not. What matters is, does it help, society be more prosperous?
Right, but that's your moral intuition is not bothered by that, and
Most
the people that
people's
we're trying to convince their moral intuitions are very bothered by that.
Yeah, well, I think morality is a product of incentives as well. Like, why are our moral values the way they are? So we can socially coordinate and that kind of thing. And this is what my wife works on. She's a social psychologist, and she works with economists, and they use game theory to explain human social behavior. And my wife teaches a class on cults and
that's
stuff
cool.
like that. Yeah,
we're big Jonathan Haidt fanboys.
Okay, all right,
here. Yeah. So I mean, I agree with in terms of the specific issues and ways in which morality can manifest. I agree is based on incentives and some things of that nature. But I do think people are born with kind of a general moral set of principle, like moral ideas.
Yeah.
And kind of the way in which they materialize is kind of created by society.
I don't know about that. Maybe a little bit. I think everybody's born different with kind of different psychology kind of by default. But, when you're thinking about aggregates and, the society as a whole, and incentives for the culture as a whole, none of that stuff kind of averages out. It doesn't really matter.
Well, I get the way that I kind of conceptualize it is, and I think this is, kind of what Haidt goes into, is that there seems to be under his 5 or 6 moral foundations, it definitely seems to be that across the board, there are like people that we would call on the left hit certain moral foundations naturally, and people on the right hit other moral foundations naturally.
I'm not a huge fan of Jonathan Haidt. I think, we might say that he is a taxonomist. He creates a taxonomy of kind of these, moral categories.
It is what he's doing.
People. Yeah. The question is, where do these categories come from? And he kind of chalks it up to, genetics, that kind of thing. But I don't think that's right. I think it comes from cultural incentives. So I don't know. We can have a whole other hour-long discussion about this stuff.
I guess. But... I mean, maybe we'll have another conversation because me and Adam think a lot of this stuff comes from evolution, and it's
evolution, but not all evolution is biological. Culture evolves.
True.
And it evolves and adapts much more quickly,
much faster
than biology does.
Right. We often offload. The point of cultural evolution is to offload that because biology is too slow. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, I agree completely.
Yeah, we get each other. Yeah.
Someone said, I want to know Alex's thoughts on military disability pay, as the top pay can reach $3,600 a month for life.
Okay. I don't really have any opinions on that. Yeah.
There you go.
I think, there's a lot of, let me say more. I think there's a lot of kind of complexity and inefficiency in how we've structured various mechanisms that get money to people. I keep emphasizing, monetary policy, but you also have, other kind of direct government benefits. And I think it's worth asking, how much of this stuff is band-aids over the fact that the way we get people their money by default is broken.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to figure it out. Like the problem that I set up is the productivity problem. The government does spend and buy productivity. Like when the government buys F-35, right? They're basically saying, I'm going to give you this money and you're going to produce this thing that I desire. And you're kind of decentralizing government spending by doing a UBI thing. Because you're saying, okay, instead of the government saying, I want, 1 million gallons of milk to feed all of my citizens, you're basically just giving the money to the people and saying, you decide what the market should produce, what productivity you want. But like I said, the hang up for me is always the fact that, well, the people are also the producers of that F-35. They're the producers of that milk. So if you disincentivize them to work to a certain extent, and I understand you keep saying we got to find the sweet spot, and I agree with that to some extent. I just I guess I'm looking for ways that we could potentially move the ball forward on UBI, first by putting together just a bulletproof argument that is just, unassailable, and also start accumulating evidence to support that argument. Because I feel like that's the next step.
Get basic income advocates all on the same page with each other. That would be a huge step.
Well, that's impossible because
me and Scott, if we were, on the same page, that would make a huge difference. And getting economists on the same page.
Would it though? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, to your example of, kind of leaving everything to the market, basic income isn't about leaving everything to the market instead of, having the government allocate resources or pay for things. It's about when you want the market to allocate resources, what kinds of mechanisms do you want to use to get the money into the market? So that's the question that basic income answers. If the government is buying F-35s and they're doing it, because they want the F-35s for their military capabilities, then, we can argue about, how big our military should be or something like that. Maybe some people are like, we shouldn't be building all these F-35s, we should be, leaving more resources for people for non-military stuff. And maybe some of that is the government giving more, buying more stuff directly for people, or the market allocating more stuff directly for people, which would be in higher basic income. But it's, if you're hiring people to build F-35s, but one of the bullet points on your PowerPoint presentation is, hey, creates X number of jobs, then you have to be like, oh, wait a minute. To what extent are we doing this to create jobs for people?
I understand that. And like I said, I completely disagree with the idea that we should be thinking in terms of, oh, this is a great way to create jobs. Like that, I'm not that person.
Yeah.
Like if we could press a button, and the complete process of creating an F-35 was automated, that would be best case scenario. If we could create F-35s with a team of, 2 people, that would be a great thing as well. Yeah. So I'm thinking strictly in terms of, we need a certain amount of labor to keep productivity at a certain level. And until we have automation, we don't necessarily know what that productivity is. And if you dump this program that all of a sudden disincentivizes people to reach that level of productivity that we need to sustain prices and sustain our quality of living, then all of a sudden that can't be sustained.
I think that's exactly right. I agree with that 100% if I understood it correctly. That's why you can't just pump too much money into the economy. Yeah, you just can't do it. So you got to get the right level.
Yeah.
You need the incentives to be there, because if people are under incentivized to work, you're not going to produce enough stuff to keep going. And if people are over incentivized to work, that's also going to lower productivity as well.
Do you want to read JMac?
JMac. Thank you so much, JMac, our circuit father. Says the F-35 is a perfect example of why I don't trust the government with spending or with my money. There were so many design issues that became money sinks to fix later on, such as different screws being used for panels literally adjacent to each other.
Yeah. So a question we could ask is how much of that inefficiency is kind of, the make work, like seeping in there. And maybe some of it is, or maybe the government's just really bad at that. I think the debate between what should the government be providing versus the market is a separate debate from whether we want to have a basic income. And certainly a basic income is an example of the government providing something, right? It's providing money that people can spend into the market.
The building of the F-35, I don't think is a government program. The government is financing it, but Lockheed Martin is a private company that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange. So
public-private partnership.
Yeah, if there's inefficiencies in the design, that's a knock on the private sector, isn't it? Feels like
It's
it.
also, it could also be a knock on the government for choosing this partner that's really bad at doing stuff.
Right, and propping it
Oh,
up.
you're right. You're right.
Because it's shielding it from private forces.
It's
Shielding it from
it's
competition,
shielding
yeah.
Lockheed Martin from private competition, isn't
Yeah.
it? By these no bid government contracts everyone talks
Yeah.
about. Okay, so
So-
there's a source of inefficiency.
Yeah.
Stug says culture evolving faster than genetics do is not a good argument. Lots of cultures have developed. How many kinds were stable on a large scale?
It's not a good argument for what?
Yeah, I'm not sure
Because
the
yeah,
question
lots
isn't-
of them have evolved and haven't been stable, and that's
Right.
part of the process of evolution, right? Like there's
Right.
different
Cultural
things happen
evolution,
and then
yes.
fail, and
Right.
well, even biological evolution, like you get like it's random mutations, right? And some of
There
them
are
are
dead
good, and some of
ends,
them are
yes.
bad, and some of them just kill you off, that kind of thing.
Right.
The process is the same, but I just in cultural evolution, it's one culture lives, one culture dies. Obviously, that is
Mhm.
the same as the biological process.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a literal fact that culture evolves faster than genetics. I mean, I don't know how you could disagree with that, but
I guess what I was arguing was that morality is associated more with cultural evolution than biological evolution.
right.
But I think, some of these cultures that died off, maybe they had really wacky moral values that caused them to not, thrive.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't
I think-
attribute.
I
a
think we might
culture
have
that-
some of those right now with our work
Maybe.
ethic.
I
Probably,
agree. You
yeah.
wanted to, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't attribute a culture that dies off as like, well, they must have had some like genetic. I mean, I don't think they had some genetic culture that made them die off or anything. So
It's usually not biology that causes
Right.
a culture to die off. Yeah.
well, I mean, usually there's some environmental problem that they can't
Yeah.
adapt to fast enough.
I think that's
so-
most of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably most of it. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Okay. Anything else floating around out there?
Well, have we answered all the?
JMac says no, Adam, because there's no profit incentive by the government, so there's no obvious oversight. Contract work is outrageously priced in the military.
Well, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's a one
Right.
buyer. They're not actually trying to get the price down. So that
Well, it's
they
'cause the
can-
government is not, since the government is not motivated by profit, they don't have the same incentive to.
Sometimes they might even want to keep the contractor might want to keep the prices up because if they can do it cheaper, then they'll lose their funding next year. The
Right.
government will say, "Oh, well, you can get it done cheaper. We'll give you less money next year."
Well, that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens internally in private sectors all the time. When
Yeah.
companies are allocating budgets, and the department's like, "Well, we can't go in under budget because then they'll give us less money next." Next year."
Exactly. Yep.
So,
Hmm.
Val says, "So, Alex, unless I'm not understanding you, is that disability pay and their benefits is that disability pay and their benefits is less about the pay and more about allocating resources, i.e., non-monetary, more efficiently?"
I'm not sure what this question means.
Yeah, because there's like limited space, so sometimes people word things in kind of difficult
is
ways.
less about. I think he's saying, should we hold on? Let's reread it again.
Unless I'm not understanding you, is that disability pay and their benefits is less about the pay and more about allocating resources, i.e., non-monetary, more efficiently?
I think he's saying giving them the resources instead of the money. Is that more efficient?
Oh, I think that just depends on which things are more efficiently allocated by the market versus the government directly. So that's kind of a general question you can ask. I think stuff like food is fairly efficiently allocated by the market. Stuff like roads and bridges are not, but those wouldn't go to specific people either. Something like healthcare, I think, is probably, at least certain aspects of it, it's more efficiently allocated directly by the government rather than having people go into the market. Some parts of it maybe are more efficient to do the market, but yeah, I mean, there's this whole debate to be had about what's most efficiently allocated by the market versus the government.
I think Thal is asking about the military disability pay just because $3,600 a month seems like a outrageous amount of money, actually just an unsustainable amount of money as far as a UBI program. Outrageous in the concept of everyone.
As far as a
that
UBI
much.
program, maybe it's appropriate for military. Like that's one of the perks that you get for signing up for the military. They know, like if you get
Mhm.
disabled, you'll be compensated in some way, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's outrageous. Like, yeah, for UBI, that would presumably be too much. But if you've, lost your ability to walk in the
Right.
military, it seems like it makes sense to me. So
Seems like a little low to me.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I think all of this stuff can be debated.
Obviously.
I don't know what the optimal level of UBI is. Maybe once the dust has settled, it turns out the economy can sustain $3,600, but I think that might be high.
All right.
Well, thanks for coming on. I would love actually, if you want to come back at some point in the future, maybe even your wife, and we could have a talk about morality. That could be interesting.
Yeah, send me a message on Twitter and we'll set that up.
Awesome.
Cool.
What are your socials so people can follow you?
At Alex Howlett UBI on Twitter.
I put it in the description too as well, so people
Nice.
can just click on it.
Yeah.
Do you have any closing questions for us, Alex?
Closing thoughts?
I was actually for a few minutes before I came on, I was watching Scott on here on YouTube, and I saw the poll, about whether people were coming in as pro-UBI or anti-UBI,
Right.
and I saw that it was at least 50% were against UBI. So I thought that was interesting.
I have the original poll numbers, so I got up to 1.1 votes or 1.1 thousand votes. And
Wow.
it was what is your starting position? So the against UBI was 50%, no opinion was 32%, and pro UBI was 16%. So and then
I was one of those pro-UBI votes, by the way.
Okay.
Nice.
Did you
So
vote
the
again?
The poll that's up now, Adam, is it a different poll?
It is. I said, so what is your position on UBI now? So
I didn't vote again.
Well, you can feel free.
It's exactly the same percentage.
Well, no,
almost.
there's some movement. What are you talking about?
Well,
the
anti side is the same, but there's a little bit more pro.
That's interesting.
The anti side is still at 50%, but the no opinion has moved from 32 to 30, and the pro UBI has moved from 16 to 21. So that's
very interesting.
We moved.
So basically, for all of the undecideds, essentially none of them went to the against UBI, and
no, they all went to the pro UBI side.
Yeah,
Nice.
wow, that's
Good
pretty
job.
powerful. I think. Yeah.
Impressive.
Cool.
Well,
I wonder how much of that was Scott and how much of that was me.
It's a joint effort.
I changed up the poll after Scott, so Scott obviously had an advantage. So.
Oh, okay, all right.
But I mean, I do think it's interesting. We have a very open-minded audience, and that's why we talk about this stuff. So. Yeah. I think it is interesting, and I'm just, like I said, I want to work on my arguments. This all began because I kept saying I was in favor of UBI, and people kept challenging me on it, and I realized, well, I mean, I'm just kind of in favor of UBI because, that's
good.
my gut intuition. Yeah, because I mean, I wanted to smoke weed and surf when I was in my 20s, and it seemed like it would be a good program to facilitate that, right? So,
yeah, if it's enough, yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
there's
all the UBI
there's a
programs
guy
that they've talked about have definitely been enough for me to surf and smoke weed in my 20s. So
there you go. Yeah.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, there's a guy who kind of was the father of is the father of the modern basic income movement. His name is Philippe Van Parijs, and he wrote a book about surfers, and he explicitly was talking about Malibu surfers, and it might be called Real Freedom for All, and it has a picture of surfboards on the front, or there might be a paper that has surfers in the title or something like that. So I just thought that was interesting that was your personal perspective as well.
Is it a UBI book? That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It is really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just I think we need to get more pro surfers in the world. I think that's really what we need.
Earlier today, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she was pretending to go to the beach with a surfboard in her room. And I thought, wow, that's great. Yeah. So she's never done that before, but she's heard about it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the against, maybe your vote clicked it over. The against UBI is actually down to 49%. So
I did vote when you guys told me to. Yeah.
There you go.
All right. So thanks for coming on, Alex. I think
thanks, guys.
Take care, man.
You too.
Enjoy the new home.
Thank you.